The navigation was monotonously continued from the 31st of May to the 10th of June. On this latter date, the Endeavour, after passing safely along an unknown coast, in the midst of shallows and breakers, for a space of 22 degrees or 1,300 miles, was all at once exposed to a greater danger than any which had been apprehended. They were in 16 degrees S lat, and degrees 39 W long. When Cook, seeing two islets lying low and covered with trees, gave orders to keep well out to sea during the night, so as to look for the islands discovered by Quiros in these latitudes, an archipelago which some geographers had maintained was united to the mainland. Shortly after 9 in the evening, the soundings taken every quarter of an hour showed constantly decreasing depth. All crowded to the deck. The water became deeper. It was concluded that the vessel had passed over the extremity of the sandbanks seen at sunset, and all rejoiced at escape from danger. When the depth increased, Cook and all but the officers of the watch retired to their berths. But at 11 o'clock the sounding line, after indicating 20 fathoms, suddenly recorded 17, and before it was possible to cast anchor, the Endeavour had touched and beaten by the waves, struck upon a rock. The situation was a serious one. The Endeavour, raised by a wave over the ridge of a reef, had fallen again into a hollow in the rock, and by the moonlight, portions of the false keel and the sheathing could be seen floating. Unfortunately, the accident happened at high water. It was useless, therefore, to count upon the assistance of the tide to release the ship. Without loss of time, the guns, barrels, casks, ballast, and all that could lighten the vessel were thrown overboard. The vessel still struck against the rock. The sloop was put to sea, the sails and topsails were lowered, the tow-lines were thrown to the starboard, and the captain was about to order the anchor to be cast on the same side, when it was discovered that the water was deeper at the stern. But although the capstan was vigorously worked, it was impossible to move the vessel. Daybreak disclosed the position in all its horrors. Land was 8 leagues distant. Not a single isle was visible between the ship and land where refuge might be found if, as was to be feared, the vessel broke up. Although she had been lightened of 50 tons weight, the sea only gained a foot and a half. Fortunately, the wind fell, otherwise the Endeavour must soon have been a wreck. However, the leak increased rapidly, although the pumps were worked incessantly. A third was put into action. The alternative was dreadful. If the vessel were freed, it must sink when no longer sustained by the rock, while if it remained fixed, it must be demolished by the waves which rent its planks asunder. The boats were too small to carry all the crew to land at one time. Under such circumstances, was there not danger that discipline would be thrown to the winds? Who could tell whether a fratricidal struggle might not ensue? And even should some of the sailors reach land, what fate could be in store for them upon an inhospitable shore, where nets and firearms would scarcely procure them nourishment? What would become of those who were obliged to remain on board? Everyone shared these fears, but so strong a sense of duty prevailed, so much was the captain beloved by his crew, that the terrors of the situation evoked no single cry, no disorder of any kind. The strength of the men not employed at the pumps was wisely harbored for the moment when their fate should be decided. Measures were so skillfully taken that when the sea rose to its height, all the officers and crew worked the capstan, and as the vessel was disengaged from the rock, it was ascertained that she drew no more water than when on the reef. But the sailors were exhausted after 24 hours of such terrible anxiety. It was necessary to change the hands at the pumps every 5 minutes. A new disaster was now added. The man whose duty it was to measure the water in the hold announced that it had increased to 18 inches in a few moments. Fortunately, the mistake of the measure taken was immediately ascertained, and the crew were so overjoyed that they fancied all danger over. An officer named Monkhouse conceived an excellent idea. He applied a sort of cap to the stern, which he filled in with wool, rope yarn, and the intestines of the animals slaughtered on board, and so effected a stoppage of the leak. From this time, the men, who spoke of driving the vessel on a coast to reconstruct another from its ruins, which might take them to the East Indies, thought only of finding a suitable harbor for the purpose. The desirable harbor was reached on the 17th of June, at the mouth of a current which Cook called Endeavour River. The necessary labors for the careening of the vessel were at once begun, and carried on with the utmost rapidity. The sick were landed, and the staff visited the land several times, in the hope of killing some game, and procuring fresh meat for the sufferers from scurvy. Tupia saw an animal which Banks, from his description, imagined to have been a wolf, but a few days later several others were seen, who jumped upon their 4 feet and took enormous leaps. They were kangaroos, marsupial animals, only met with in Australia, and which had never before seen a European. The natives in this spot appeared far less savage than on other parts of the coast. They not only allowed the English to approach but treated them cordially and remained several days with them. They were kangaroos. They were kangaroos. The narrative says, they were usually of medium height, but their limbs were remarkably small. Their skin was the color of soot, or rather, it might be described as of deep chocolate color. Their hair was black and not woolly, and was cut short. Some wore it plaited, some curled. Various portions of their bodies were painted red, and one of them had white stripes on his lips and breast, which he called carbanda. Their features were far from disagreeable. They had very bright eyes, white and even teeth, and their voices were sweet and musical. Some among them wore a nose ornament which Cook had not met with in New Zealand. It was a bone, as large as a finger, passed through the cartilage. A little later, a quarrel arose. The crew had taken possession of some tortoises which the natives claimed, without having in the least assisted in capturing them. When they found that their demand was not acceded to, they retired in fury and set fire to the shrubs in the midst of which the English encampment was situated. The latter lost all their combustible commodities in the conflagration, and the fire, leaping from hill to hill, afforded a magnificent spectacle during the night. Meantime, Messrs. Banks, Solander, and others enjoyed many successful hunts. They killed kangaroos, opossums, a species of polecat, wolves, and various kinds of serpents, some of which were venomous. They also saw numbers of birds, kites, hawks, cockatoos, orioles, paroquets, pigeons, and other unknown birds. Tahitian fleet off Opry. Tahitian fleet off Opry. Facsimile of early engraving. After leaving Endeavour River, Cook had good opportunities of testing the difficulties of navigation in these latitudes. Rocks and shallows abounded. It was necessary to cast anchor in the evening, for it was impossible to proceed at night through this labyrinth of rocks without striking. The sea, as far as the eye could reach, appeared to dash upon one line of rocks more violently than upon the others. This appeared to be the last. Upon arriving there, after 5 days' struggle with a contrary wind, Cook discovered 3 islands stretching 4 or 5 leagues to the north. But his difficulties were not over. The vessel was once more surrounded by reefs and chains of low islets, amongst which it was impossible to venture. Cook was inclined to think it would be more prudent to return and seek another passage. But such a detour would have consumed too much time and have retarded his arrival in the East Indies. Moreover, there was an insurmountable obstacle to this course. 3 months' provisions were all that remained. The situation appeared desperate, and Cook decided to steer as far as possible from the coast and to try and pass the exterior line of rocks. He soon found a channel, which shortly brought them to the open sea. So happy a change in the situation, says Kippis, was received with delight. The English were full of it and openly expressed their joy. For nearly 3 months they had been in perpetual danger. When at night they rested at anchor, the sound of an angry sea forced them to remember that they were surrounded by rocks, and that, should the cable break, shipwreck was inevitable. They had traveled over 360 miles and were forced to keep a man incessantly throwing the line and sounding the rocks through which they navigated. Possibly no other vessel could furnish an example of such continued effort. Had they not just escaped so terrible a danger, the English would have had cause for uneasiness in reflecting upon the length of way that remained to them across a sea but little known, upon a vessel which let in 9 inches of water in an hour. With pumps out of repair and provisions almost consumed, the navigators only escaped these terrible dangers to be exposed on the 16th of April to a peril of equal magnitude. Carried by the waves to a line of rocks above which the sea spray washed to a prodigious height, making it impossible to cast anchor. Without a breath of wind, they had but one resource, to lower boats to tow the vessel off. In spite of the sailors' efforts, the Endeavour was still only 100 paces from the reef, when a light breeze, so slight that under better circumstances no one would have noticed it, arose and disengaged the vessel. But 10 minutes later it fell, the current strongly returned, and the Endeavour was once more carried within 200 feet of the breakers. After many unsuccessful attempts, a narrow opening was perceived. The danger it offered was less imminent than that of remaining in so terrible a situation, says the narrative. A light breeze which fortunately sprang up, the efforts of the boats and the tide, conveyed the ship to the opening, across which she passed with frightful rapidity. The strength of the current prevented the Endeavour from touching either shore of the channel, which, however, was but a mile in width and extremely unequal in depth, giving now 30 fathoms, now only 7 of foul bottom. If we have lingered somewhat over the incidents of this voyage, it is because it was accomplished in unknown seas, in the midst of breakers and currents, which, sufficiently dangerous for a sailor when they are marked on a map, become much more so when, as was the case with Cook, since leaving the coast of New Holland, the voyage is made in the face of unknown obstacles, which all the instinct and keen vision of the sailor cannot always successfully surmount. One last question remained to be solved. Were New Holland and New Guinea portions of one country? Were they divided by an arm of the sea or by a strait? In spite of the dangers of such a course, Cook approached the shore and followed the coast of Australia towards the north. On the 21st, he doubled the most northerly cape of New Holland, to which he gave the name of Cape York, and entered a channel sprinkled with islands near the mainland, which inspired him with the hope of finding a passage to the Indian Ocean. Once more he landed, and planting the English flag, solemnly took possession in the name of King George of the entire eastern coast from the 18th degree of latitude to this spot, situated in 107 degrees south. He gave the name of New South Wales to this territory, and to fitly conclude the ceremony, he caused 3 salutes to be fired. Cook next penetrated Torres Strait, which he called Endeavour Strait, discovered and named the Wallis Islands, situated in the middle of the southwest entrance to Booby Island and Prince of Wales Island, and steered for the southern coast of New Guinea, which he followed until the 3rd of September without being able to land. Upon that day Cook landed with about 11 well-armed men, amongst them Solander, Banks, and his servants. They were scarcely a quarter of a mile from their ship, when 3 Indians emerged from the wood, uttering piercing cries, and rushed at the English. The one who came nearest, says the narrative, threw something which he carried at his side with his hand, and it burned like gunpowder, but we heard no report. 3 Indians emerged from the wood. 3 Indians emerged from the wood. Cook and his companions were obliged to fire upon the natives in order to regain their ship, from whence they could examine them at their leisure. They resembled the Australians entirely, and like them, wore their hair short and were perfectly naked, only their skin was less dark, no doubt because they were less dirty. Meantime the natives struck their fire at intervals, 4 or 5 at a time. We could not imagine what this fire could be, nor their object in throwing it. They held in the hand a short stick, perhaps a hollow cane, which they flourished from side to side, and at the same instant we saw the fire and smoke exactly as it flashes from a gun, and it lasted no longer. We observed this astonishing phenomenon from the vessel, and the illusion was so great that those on board believed the Indians had firearms, and we ourselves should have imagined they fired guns, but that our ship was so close that in such a case we must have heard the explosion. This fact remains unexplained, in spite of the many commentaries it has occasioned, and which bear out the testimony of the great navigator. Many of the English officers demanded immediate permission to land in search of coconuts, arid other fruits, but the captain was unwilling to risk his sailors' lives in so futile an attempt. He was, besides, anxious to reach Batavia to obtain repairs for his vessel. He thought it useless, moreover, to remain a longer time in these latitudes. They had been so often visited by the Spanish and Dutch that there were no further discoveries to make. In passing Arrow and Wessel Islands, he rectified their positions, and reaching Timor, put into port in Savu Island, where the Dutch had been settled for some time. Their cook revictualled, and by accurate observations settled its position at 10 degrees 35 southern latitude and degrees 30 west longitude. After a short interval the Endeavour arrived at Batavia, where she was repaired. But the stay in that unhealthy country was fatal after such severe fatigue. Endemic fevers raged there, and Banks, Solander, and Cook, as well as the greater part of the crew, fell ill. Many died, amongst them Monkhouse, the surgeon, Tupia, and little Taito. 10 men only escaped the fever. The Endeavour set sail on the 27th of December, and on the 15th of January, 1771, put into Prince of Wales Island for victuals. From that moment sickness increased among the crew. 23 men died, amongst them Green, the astronomer, who was much regretted. After a stay at the Cape of Good Hope, where he met with the welcome he so sorely needed, Cook re-embarked, touched at St. Helena, and anchored in the Downs on the 11th of June, 1772, after an absence of nearly 4 years. Thus, says Kippis, ended Cook's first voyage, a voyage in which he had experienced such dangers, discovered so many countries, and so often evinced his superiority of character. He was well worthy of the dangerous enterprise and of the courageous efforts to which he had been called. Chapter 4. Captain Cook's Second Voyage. 1. Search for the southern continent. Second stay at New Zealand, Paumotu Archipelago. Second stay at Tahiti, reconnoitering Tonga Isles. Third stay at New Zealand, second crossing of the Southern Ocean. Easter Island reconnoitered, visit to the Marquesas Islands. Had the government not been desirous of rewarding James Cook for the way in which he had fulfilled the mission entrusted to him, the unanimous voice of the public would have constrained them. On the 29th of August, he received the rank of commander in the Royal Navy. But the great navigator, proud of the services he had rendered to England and to science, thought the reward less than his achievements merited. He would have delighted in an appointment as ship's captain, but Lord Sandwich, who was then at the head of the Admiralty, pointed out to him that it was not possible to gratify him without upsetting all established customs and injuring the discipline of the Royal Navy. However, Cook busied himself in putting together the necessary materials for the narration of his experiences, but being soon occupied with still more important matters, he placed them in the hands of Dr. Hawkesworth, who was to superintend their publication. At the same time, the observations he had taken on the transit of Mercury, in concert with Mr. Green, his calculations and astronomical solutions, were submitted to the consideration of the Royal Society, and that learned body at once recognized his merit. In one respect, however, the important results obtained by Cook were incomplete. He had not perfectly proved the impossibility of an Antarctic continent. This chimera was still dear to the hearts of scientific men, although obliged to admit that neither New Zealand nor Australia made part of such a continent, and that the Endeavour had navigated in latitudes in which it might have been found. They still affirmed that it would be found still more south, and reiterated all those advantages which its discovery would entail. The government determined to settle a question which had been discussed for so many years, and to dispatch an expedition for the purpose. Its commander was easily selected. The nature of the voyage demanded vessels of peculiar construction. As the Endeavour had been sent to the Falkland Islands, the Admiralty gave orders for the purchase of the two suitable vessels for the purpose. Cook was consulted, and insisted that the ships should be solidly built, draw little water, and possess capacity for carrying provisions and ammunition in proportion to the number of the crew and the length of the voyage. The Admiralty accordingly bought two vessels, constructed at Whitby by the same shipbuilder as the Endeavour. The larger was of 462 tons burden and was named the Resolution. The second was only of 336 tons and was called the Adventure. Cook received command of the Resolution, and Captain Tobias Furneaux, second lieutenant of the Wallis, was raised to the command of the Adventure. The second and third officers and several of the crew had already served in the Endeavour. It may readily be imagined that every possible care was taken in the equipment of these ships. Lord Sandwich and Captain Palliser themselves superintended every detail. Each of the ships was stocked with provisions of every kind for 2 years and a half. Very extraordinary articles were provided at the instance of Captain Cook, who claimed them as antiscorbutics. For instance, malt, sauerkraut, salted cabbages, soup slabs, mustard and salloup, as well as carrot marmalade, and thickened and unfermented beer, which was tried at the suggestion of Baron Storch of Berlin and Mr. Pelham, secretary to the Commissariat Department. Equal care was taken to ship 2 small boats, each of 20 tons, intended to carry the crew in case of shipwreck. William Hodges, a landscape painter, 2 naturalists, John Reinhold Forster and his son George, 2 astronomers, W. Wales and W. Bailey, accompanied the expedition, provided with the best instruments for observation. Nothing that could conduce to the success of the adventure was neglected. It was to return with an immense amount of collected information, which was to contribute to the progress of the natural and physical sciences and to the ethnology of navigation and geography. Cook says, I received my instructions at Plymouth dateth June. They enjoined my immediate departure for the island of Madeira, to ship wine there, and thence to proceed to the Cape of Good Hope, where I was to let the crew have a spree on shore and obtain the provisions and other stores I needed, to advance southwards and endeavor to find Circumcision Cape, which was said to have been discovered by M. Bouvet in the 54 degrees southern parallel and about 11 degrees 20 east longitude, reckoning from Greenwich. If I found this cape, to ascertain whether it was part of the continent or an island. Should it prove the former, to neglect no opportunity of investigating its possible extent, to collect facts of every kind which might be useful to navigation and commerce, or would tend to the progress of the natural sciences. I was desired to observe the spirit, temperament, character, and means of the inhabitants, should there be any, and to use every fair means of forming friendly alliances with them. My instructions proceeded to enjoin me to seek discoveries in the east or west, according to the position in which I might find myself, and advised my nearing the South Pole as much as possible, and as long as the condition of the ships, the health of the crew, and the provisions allowed of my doing so. To be careful in any case to reserve sufficient provisions to reach some known port, where I might refit for my return to England. In addition, I was ordered, if I found Circumcision Cape to be an island, or if I did not succeed in finding it, in the first case to take the necessary bearings, and in both to sail southward, as long as I still hoped to find the continent. Then to proceed eastward, to look for this continent, and to discover the islands which might be situated in this part of the southern hemisphere. To remain in high latitudes and to prosecute my discoveries, as had been already said, as near the pole as possible, until I had completed the navigation of the world, and finally to repair to the Cape of Good Hope, and from thence to Spithead. Cook left Plymouth Harbor on the 13th of July, and on the 29th of the same month he arrived at Funchal, in Madeira. Here he took in provisions and continued his route southwards, but being shortly convinced that his supply of water would not hold out until he reached the Cape of Good Hope, he determined to break the voyage by putting in at Cape Verde Islands, and on the 10th of August he anchored in Praia port, which he left 4 days later. Cook availed himself of his stay in this port, as he usually did, to collect every fact which might be useful to navigators. His description is the more valuable now, as these parts have completely changed in character, and the conditions of a stay in port have been greatly modified by the improvements accomplished there. On the 23rd of the same month, after violent squalls which had driven everyone on deck, Cook, aware of the pernicious effect of the damp of warm climates, and always on the alert to keep his crew in good health, gave orders to aerate, renew the air in the between decks. He even had a fire lighted in order to smoke it, and dry it quickly, and not only took the precautions advocated by Lord Sandwich and Sir Hugh Palliser, but also those which the experience of his last voyage suggested to him. Thanks to all these efforts at prevention, there was not a single sick case on board the Resolution when she arrived at the Cape of Good Hope on the 30th of October. Cook, in company with Captain Furneaux and Messrs. Foster, went to pay a visit to the Dutch governor, Baron de Plettenberg, who placed all the resources of the colony at his disposal. There he found that 2 French ships, which had left the island of Mauritius in March, had touched at the Cape before proceeding to the southern seas where they were to prosecute discoveries, under command of Captain Marion. During this stay in port, which was longer than they expected, Forster met the Swedish botanist Sparman, a pupil of Linnaeus, and engaged him to accompany him, by promising him large pay. It is difficult to praise Forster's disinterestedness under these circumstances too highly. He had no hesitation in admitting a rival, and even paid his expenses, in order to add completeness to the studies in natural history, which he wished to make in the countries he was about to visit. Anchor was weighed on the 22nd of November, and the 2 ships resumed their course southwards, in search of Cape Circumcision, discovered by Captain Bouvet, on the 1st of January, 1739. As the temperature would rapidly become colder, Cook distributed the warm clothes, furnished by the Admiralty, to his sailors. From the 29th of November till the 6th of December, a frightful tempest prevailed. The ships, driven out of their course, were carried to the east, to such a degree that they were forced to resume the search for Circumcision Cape. Another consequence of the bad weather, and of the sudden change from heat to extreme cold, was the death of all the animals embarked at the Cape. And lastly, the sailors suffered so much from the damp, that it was necessary to increase the rations of brandy to stimulate them to work. On the 10th of December, in 50 degrees 40 southern latitude, the first ice was met with. Rain and snow succeeded each other uninterruptedly. The fog soon became so dense that the crews did not perceive a floating iceberg until they were a mile past it. One of these, says the narrative, was not less than 200 feet high, 400 wide and long. Taking it as probable that this piece was of absolutely equal size, its depth beneath the water, would have been 1,800 feet, and its height about 2,000 feet, and from the dimensions just given its entire bulk must have contained million cubic feet of ice. Among the icebergs, among the icebergs, as they proceeded further south, the icebergs increased. The sea was so rough that the waves climbed these glacial blocks and fell on the other side in fine, impalpable dust. The scene filled the observers with admiration, but this was soon succeeded by terror, upon the reflection that if the vessel struck one of these enormous masses, she must be dashed to pieces. The presence of danger soon, however, produced indifference, and more thought was bestowed upon the sublime beauty than upon the strife with this terrible element. Upon the 14th of December, an enormous iceberg, which closed in the horizon, prevented the two vessels from proceeding southwards, and it became absolutely necessary to skirt it. It did not present an unbroken surface, for hillocks were visible on it, similar to those met on the previous days. Some thought they distinguished land under the ice. Even Cook for the moment was deceived, but as the fog lifted, the mistake was easily rectified. Next day the vessels were driven before a strong current. The elder Forster in Wales, the astronomer, embarked in a small boat to ascertain its swiftness. Whilst thus engaged, the fog became so dense that they completely lost sight of the ship. In this miserable boat, without instruments or provisions, in the midst of the wide ocean, far from any coast, surrounded by ice, their situation was dreadful. They left off rowing, lest they should get farther from the ship. They were losing all hope when the sound of a distant bell fell upon their ears. They rowed swiftly in the direction of the sound. The Adventure replied to their shouts and picked them up after several hours of terrible suspense. The generally received opinion was that the ice floats collected in the bays or mouths of rivers. The explorers, therefore, imagined themselves near land, which would prove to be situated in the south behind the vast iceberg. They were 30 leagues to the west of it, before they found an opening in the ice which might lead to the south. The captain then determined to steer an equal distance to the east. Should he not find land, he at least hoped to double the iceberg and penetrate in advance of it to the pole, and thereby settle the doubts of all the physicists. But although it was the middle of summer in this part of the world, the cold became daily more intense. The sailors complained of it, and symptoms of scurvy appeared on board. Warmer clothes were distributed, and recourse was had to the remedies usual in such cases, malt and lemon juice, which soon overcame the malady and enabled the crews to bear the severity of the temperature. On the 29th of December, Cook ascertained positively that the iceberg was joined to no land. He therefore decided to proceed eastward as far as the parallel of Cape Circumcision, that is, if no obstacle prevented him. He had scarcely put this resolve into execution when the wind became so violent, and the sea so rough, that navigation, in the midst of floating ice, which crashed with a fearful noise, became most perilous. The danger increased when a field of ice extending beyond the range of vision was seen to the north. There seemed every prospect of the ships being imprisoned for many weeks, hemmed in, to use the expression of whalers, if indeed they did not run the risk of being crushed at once. Cook neither tried to run to the west or east, he steered straight for the south. He was now in the latitude attributed to Cape Circumcision, and 70 leagues south of the position assigned to it. Hence he concluded that if land existed as stated by Bouvet, which is now known to be a fact, it could only be an inconsiderable island, and not a large continent. The captain had no further reason for remaining in these latitudes. In 67 degrees 15 southern latitude a new ice barrier, running from east to west, closed the passage for him, and he could find no opening in it. Prudence enjoined his remaining no longer in this region, for 2/3 of the summer were already past. He therefore determined to seek, with no further delay, the land recently discovered by the French. On the 1st of February, 1773, the vessels were in 48 degrees 30 south latitude and degrees 7 west longitude, very nearly the parallel attributed to St. Maurice Island. After a fruitless cruise, productive of no results, they were forced to conclude that if there really were land in these latitudes, it could only be a small island. Otherwise, it could not have escaped their search. New Zealand War Canoe. New Zealand War Canoe. Facsimile of early engraving. On the 8th of February, the captain found to his dismay that the Adventure was no longer sailing with him. He waited in vain for 2 days, firing at close intervals and keeping great fires upon the deck all night. The the Resolution had to continue her voyage alone. On the morning of the 17th of February, between 12 and 3 o'clock, the crew witnessed a magnificent spectacle, then first seen by European eyes. It was an aurora borealis. The officer of the watch, says the narrative, noticed that from time to time rays left it in spiral and circular forms, and that then its brilliancy increased, which gave it an extremely beautiful appearance. It appeared to have no particular bearing, but remained motionless in the heavens, which it filled entirely from time to time, by throwing its light to all parts. After another attempt to pass the Arctic Circle, an attempt which the fogs, the rain, the snow, and the ice blocks forced him to relinquish, Cook resumed his course to the north, convinced that he left no large land behind him, and regained New Zealand, which he had agreed upon with the Adventure as a rendezvous in the event of separation. On the 25th of March, he cast anchor in Dusky Bay, after 170 consecutive days of sea, in which he had not made less than 3,660 leagues, without one sight of land. As soon as he could find suitable anchorage, the captain hastened to avail himself of the resources for feeding his crew, which the country furnished in fowls, fish, and vegetables, whilst he himself, generally with the plumb line in his hand, traversed the environs of the bay. He met only a few natives, with whom he had little intercourse, but one family, becoming somewhat familiarized, established itself 100 yards from the landing place. Cook gave a concert for them, in which the fife and cornet were lavished on them in vain. The New Zealanders awarded the palm to the drum. On the 18th of April, a chief came on board with his daughter. But before entering the ship, he rapped her sides with a green wand he held in his hand, and addressed an harangue or invocation in modulated accents to the strangers, a very general custom with the islanders of the Southern Sea. Scarcely was his foot on deck when he offered the captain a bit of cloth and a green talc hatchet, an unprecedented act of generosity for a New Zealander. The chief visited every part of the ship. In order to testify his gratitude to the captain, he plunged his fingers into a bag at his waist and offered to anoint his hair with the tainted oil it contained. Cook had much difficulty in escaping from this proof of affection, which had not been very pleasing to Byron in the Strait of Magellan. But the painter Hodges was forced to submit to the operation, to the amusement of the entire crew. The chief then departed to return no more, taking with him 9 hatchets and 30 pairs of carpenter's scissors, which the officers had given him. Richer than all the New Zealanders put together, he no doubt hastened to stow away his treasures, in the fear that someone would deprive him of them. Before leaving, Cook landed 5 geese, the last of those he had brought from the Cape, thinking that they would multiply in this little inhabited spot, and he had a plot of land cleared in which he planted kitchen garden seeds. Thus he worked at the same time for the natives and for the future navigators who should find precious resources here. When Cook had completed the hydrographical survey of Dusky Bay, he started for Queen Charlotte's Sound, the rendezvous assigned to Captain Furneaux. On the 17th of May, the crew witnessed a magnificent spectacle. 6 waterspouts, one of them 60 feet wide at its base, were visible 100 feet from the ship in succession, drawing the clouds and sea into communication by their powerful suction. This phenomenon lasted 3/4 of an hour, and the first feeling of fear which it awakened in the breasts of the crew was soon merged in one of admiration, the greater as at this time such marvels were little known. Next day, just as the Resolution entered Queen Charlotte's Sound, the Adventure was seen, and proved to have been waiting for 6 weeks. Furneaux, after reaching Van Diemen's Land on the 1st of March, had coasted it for 17 days, but he was forced to desist before ascertaining whether it was, as he supposed, a part of New Holland. The refutation of this error was reserved for the surgeon, Bass. On the 9th of April, after reaching Queen Charlotte's Sound, the captain of the Adventure had profited by his leisure to lay out a garden and to open relations with the natives, who had furnished him with irresistible proofs of their cannibalism. Before he continued his voyage of discovery, Cook followed the same line of conduct as at Dusky Bay. He landed a ram and a sheep, a goat and a she-goat, a pig and a sow. He also planted potatoes, which only existed upon the more southerly of the 2 islands which form New Zealand. The natives resembled those of Dusky Bay, but they appeared more thoughtless, ran from room to room during supper, and devoured everything that was offered to them. It was impossible to induce them to taste wine or brandy, but they were very partial to sugar and water. Cook says, "They laid hands on all they saw, but they gave up anything so soon as we made them understand by signs that we could not, or would not give it to them. They particularly admired glass bottles, which they called taho, but when the durability and use of iron was explained to them, they preferred it to glassware, ribbons, or white paper. Amongst them were several women, whose lips were covered with little holes, painted a bluish black, whilst vivid red formed of chalk and oil covered their cheeks. Like the natives of Dusky Bay, they had small legs and bodies, but thick knees, which proves that they take little exercise and sit cross-legged. The almost perpetual squatting in their pirogues no doubt also adds to these peculiarities. The color of their skin is clear brown, their hair is very black, their faces are round, their nose and lips are somewhat thick but not flat, their eyes are black and bright enough and tolerably expressive. Placed in a row, the natives took off their outer garments, and one of them sang a rough sort of song, the others accompanying him with gestures. They stretched out their hands and alternately struck their feet against the ground with frantic contortions. The last words they repeated in chorus, and we easily distinguished a sort of meter, but I am not sure that there was any rhyme. The music was wild and monotonous. Some of the New Zealanders begged for news of Tupia, and when they heard of his death, they expressed their grief by a kind of lamentation, plainly artificial. Cook did not recognize a single native whom he had met on his first voyage. He naturally concluded that the natives who in 1770 inhabited the Sound had been chased out, or had gone elsewhere of their free will. The number of inhabitants, too, was reduced by a third. The Pa was deserted, as well as a number of cabins along the coast. New Zealand utensils and weapons. New Zealand utensils and weapons. The two ships being ready to return to sea, Cook gave instructions to Captain Furneaux. He wished to advance southward between 41 degrees to 46 degrees S lat, up to 140 degrees west longitude, and if he found no land, to steer towards Tahiti, which was appointed as the place of rendezvous. He then proposed to return to New Zealand and survey all the unknown parts of the sea between that island and Cape Horn. Towards the end of July, after a few days' hot weather, scurvy again broke out on board the Adventure. The Resolution escaped the scourge, owing to the precautions from which Cook never departed for a single day, and the example which he himself set of constantly eating celery and scurvy grass. On the 1st of July, the two vessels were in S lat, 25 degrees 1 and degrees 6 W long, the situation which Carteret attributed to Pitcairn Island. Cook endeavored to find it, but, to his great regret, the illness on board the Adventure shortened his cruise. He was anxious to verify or rectify the longitude of this island, and by so doing, that of all the surrounding lands discovered by Carteret, which had not been confirmed by astronomical observations. But having no longer any hope of finding an Antarctic continent, he set sail for the northwest, and soon reconnoitered several of the islands seen by Bougainville. The outlying islands with which the Pacific Ocean abounds between the tropics, he says, are on a level with the waves in the low parts, and raised only a rood or two above them in the others. Their shape is often circular. In the center they contain a basin of sea water, and the depth of water all round is not to be sounded. They produce little. Coconuts appear to be the best of their productions. Yet in spite of this sterility, and of their small extent, most of them are inhabited. It is not easy to conceive how these little settlements were peopled, and it is not less difficult to determine from whence the highest islands of the southern sea drew their inhabitants. On the 15th of April, Cook reconnoitered Osnaburg or Mara Islands, discovered by Wallis, and set off for Adedipiha, where he intended to embark as many provisions as possible before reaching Matavai. At daybreak, says Forster, we rejoiced in one of those beautiful mornings which poets of every country have tried to paint. A light breeze brought a delicious perfume from the land and ruffled the surface of the water. The forest-capped mountains elevated their majestic heads, over which the rising sun shed his beams. Close to us we saw a ridge of hills, of gentler ascent but wooded like the first, and pleasantly intermixed with green and brown tints. Below, a plain adorned with breadfruit trees, and a quantity of palms in the background, overshadowing the delightful groves. All seemed still asleep. Dawn was but just breaking, and the country was wrapped in peaceful darkness. Yet we could perceive the houses amid the trees, and the pirogues on the shore. Half a mile from the beach, the waves broke over a reach of rocks level with the sea, and nothing could equal the tranquility of the interior flow of the harbor. The day star shed its luster on the plain, the natives rose, and by degrees added life to this charming scene. At the sight of our vessels, several launched their pirogues in haste, and paddled towards us, as we were happily watching them. We little thought that we were going to run into great danger, and that destruction would soon threaten the vessels and their crews on this fortunate coast. Skillful the writer, happy the painter, who knew how to find such fresh and varied colors. This enchanting picture is conveyed in a few words. One regrets not having accompanied this bold sailor, this scientist who so well understood Dame Nature. Unfortunately, we could not visit these innocent and peaceable inhabitants in that age of gold to which our own century offers a painful comparison. The vessels were half a league from a reef when the wind fell. In spite of every effort, the ships were driven upon the rocks, in the very sight of the much-coveted land, when a clever maneuver of the captains, ably seconded by the tide and the land breeze, came to their rescue. They had, however, received some injuries, and the Adventure lost 3 anchors. The ships were surrounded by a crowd of pirogues, and every variety of fruit was exchanged for glass beads. Still, the natives offered neither fowls nor pigs. Those that were seen near the cabins belonged to the king, and they had no right to sell them. Several of the Tahitans begged for news of Banks and the companions of Cook's earlier voyage. Some also inquired for news of Tupia, but they spoke no more of him when they had learned the circumstances of his death. Next day, the 2 vessels anchored in the roadstead of Adedi Piha, 2 cable lengths from the shore, and were besieged by visitors and traffickers. Some profited by the crush to throw the merchandise they had already sold into their canoes, that they might sell it over again. To put a stop to this trick, Cook drove the perpetrators away, after having flogged them, a punishment which they accepted without complaining. In the afternoon, the 2 captains landed, to examine the watering place, which they found very convenient. During their absence, a crowd of natives came on board, and amply confirmed the unenviable reputation they had acquired in the earlier records of Bougainville and Cook. One of the officers, standing on the quarterdeck, says the narrative, desiring to give a child 6 years old, in one of the pirogues, some glass beads, let them fall into the sea. The child at once jumped into the water and dived until he recovered them. To reward his skill, he threw other trifles to him, a generosity which tempted a crowd of men and women, who amused us by their surprising agility in the waves. Their easy attitudes in the water, and the suppleness of their limbs, made them like amphibious animals. But the Tahitans who came on board were detected in several acts of theft. One of them, who remained for the greater part of the day in Cook's bedroom, hastened to jump into the sea, and the captain, enraged by his conduct, had shots fired over his head. A boat, sent to take the pirogues of the robbers, was assailed with stones until it reached the shore, and it was only after a discharge of shot that the assailants determined to retreat. These hostilities led to no result. The natives came on board as if nothing had occurred. Cook learned from them that the greater part of his old friends from the neighborhood of Matavai had fallen in a battle between the inhabitants of the 2 peninsulas. The officers made many excursions on land. Forster, animated by an ardor for botanical research, missed none of them. In one of these, he witnessed the method employed by the Tahitans in preparing their stuffs. We had gone but a few paces, he says, when a noise from the forest struck upon our ears. Following the sounds, we reached a little tent, where 5 or 6 women sitting upon either side of a large square piece of wood were thrashing the fibrous bark of mulberry trees to fabricate their stuffs. For this purpose, they used a bit of square wood, with long parallel grooves more or less hollowed, according to the different sides. They paused a moment to enable us to examine the bark, the hammer, and the beam which served them for a table. They also showed us a kind of gum water in a large coconut, which they used from time to join the various bits of bark together. This glue, which appears to us to be obtained from the Hibiscus esculentus, is absolutely needful in the fabrication of the stuff, which being occasionally 2 or 3 yards wide and 50 long, are composed of small pieces of the bark. The women employed at this work wore very old and ragged clothes, and their hands were hard and knotted. The same day Forster saw a man with very long nails, of which he was immensely proud, as proving that he was not obliged to work for his bread. In Annam, in China and other countries, this singular and ridiculous fashion is common. A single finger is kept with a shorter nail, being the one used to scratch with, a very frequent occupation in the extreme east. In another of his walks Forster saw a native, who passed his days in being fed by his wives, quietly lying upon a carpet of thick shrubs. This melancholy person, who fattened without rendering any service to society, recalled Sir John Mandeville's anger at seeing such a glutton who passed his days without distinguishing himself by any feats of arms, and who lived in pleasure, as a pig which one fattens in a sty. who passed his days in being fed by his wives. Who passed his days in being fed by his wives. On the 22nd of August, Cook, having learned that King Wahitua was in the neighborhood, and being desirous of seeing him, landed with Captain Furneaux, the Forsters, and several natives. He met him advancing towards him with a numerous suite, and recognized him at once as he had seen him several times in 1769. This king was then a child, and was called Te but he had changed his name at the death of his father Wahitua. He made the captain sit down on his stool, and inquired solicitously for the various Englishmen he had known on the former voyage. Cook, after the usual compliments, presented him with a shirt, a hatchet, some nails, and other trifles. But of all his presents, that which appeared most precious to him, and which excited most cries of admiration from his followers, was a tuft of red feathers mounted upon iron wire. Wahitua, king of Little Tahiti, was about 17 or 18 years of age. Tall and well-made, his appearance would have been majestic, but for a look of fear and distrust. He was surrounded by several chiefs and noble personages, remarkable for their height, and one of whom, tattooed in a peculiar manner, was enormously stout. The king, who showed him great deference, consulted him every moment. Cook then learned that a Spanish vessel had put into Tahiti a few months previously, and he afterwards ascertained that it was that of Domingo Buenechia, which came from Callao. Whilst Eddie, the king's confidant, conversed with some officers upon religious subjects, and asked the English if they had a god, Wahitua amused himself with the captain's watch. Astonished at the noise it made, and venting his surprise in the words, "It speaks," he inquired of what use it was. It was explained to him that it told the time, and in that respect resembled the sun. Wahitua gave it the name of the Little Sun, to show that he understood the explanation. The vessels sailed on the morning of the 24th, and were followed for a long time by numbers of pirogues bearing coconuts and fruit. Rather than lose this opportunity of obtaining European commodities, the natives parted with their wares very cheaply. A dozen coconuts could be obtained for one glass bead. The abundant fresh provisions soon restored the health of all on board the vessels, and most of the sailors, who on reaching Osnaburg could scarcely walk, could get about well when they left. The Resolution and Adventure reached Matavai Bay on the 26th. A crowd of Tahitians soon invaded the deck. Most of them were known to the captain, and Lieutenant Pickersgill, who had accompanied Wallis in 1767, and Cook 2 years later, received a warm welcome from them. Cook had tents erected for the sick, the sail menders, and the coopers, and then left with Captain Furneaux and the 2 Forsters for Opry. The boat which took them soon passed a morai of stones, and a cemetery known as the Morai of Tudeha. When Cook called it by this name, one of the natives who accompanied him interrupted him by saying that since Tudeha's death it was called O2. A fine lesson for princes, who thus in their lives are reminded that they are mortal, and that after their death the earth which contains their corpse will not be their own. The chief and his wife removed the upper garments from their shoulders as they passed, a mark of respect which natives of all ranks exhibit before a morai, as they appear to attach a particular idea of sanctity to these places. Cook soon gained admittance to the presence of King Otu. After many compliments, he offered him all that he thought he had which would please him, because he appreciated the advantage this man's friendship would be to him, for his every word showed timidity of disposition. Tall and well-made, the king was about 30 years old. He inquired after Tupia and Cook's companions, although he had seen none of them. Many presents were distributed to those of his cortege, who appeared the most influential. Otu, King of Otaheite. Otu, King of Otaheite. Facsimile of early engraving. The women sent their servants to find large pieces of their finest stuffs, tinted scarlet, rose, and straw color, and perfumed with the most odoriferous oil. They placed them over our outer clothing, and so loaded us that we could scarcely move. Otu paid the captain a visit on the morrow. He only came on board after Cook had been enveloped in a considerable quantity of the most costly native stuff, and he dared not go below until his brother had first done so. The king and his suite were seated for breakfast, at which the natives went into ecstasies over the usefulness of chairs. Too would not taste anything, but his companions were far from following his example. He greatly admired a beautiful spaniel belonging to Forster, and expressed a wish to possess it. It was at once given to him, and he had it carried behind him by one of his lords-in-waiting. After breakfast the captain himself conducted Otu to his sloop, and Captain Furneaux gave him a pair of goats. Upon an excursion to the interior, Mr. Pickersgill met the aged Obria, who appeared to have lost all her honors, and she was so poor that it was impossible for her to give a present to her friends. When Cook left on the 1st of September, a young Tahitian, named Porio, begged to accompany him. The captain consented, hoping that he might prove useful. The moment he lost sight of land, poor Porio could not restrain his tears. The officers comforted him by promising to be like fathers to him. Cook directed his course to Huhine Island, which was only 25 leagues distant, and anchored there at 3 in the morning. The natives brought quantities of large fowls, which were the more acceptable as it had been impossible to obtain any at Tahiti. Pigs, dogs, and fruit were in the market, and were exchanged for hatchets, nails, and glassware. This island, like Tahiti, showed traces of earlier volcanic eruptions, and the summit of one of its hills resembled a crater. The appearance of the country is similar to that of Tahiti, but is on a smaller scale, for Huahine is only 7 or 8 leagues in circumference. Cook went to see his old friend Orea. The king, dispensing with all ceremony, threw himself on the captain's neck and shed tears of joy. Then he presented him to his friends, to whom the captain gave presents. The king offered Cook all his most precious possessions, for he looked upon this man as a father. Orea promised to supply the English with all they needed and most loyally kept his word. However, on the morning of the 6th, the sailors who presided over the traffic were insulted by a native covered with red, in war dress, and holding a club who threatened every one. Cook, landing at this moment, threw himself on the native, struggled with him, and finally possessed himself of his weapon, which he broke. The same day, another incident occurred. Spamman had imprudently penetrated to the interior of the island to make botanical researches. Some natives, taking advantage of the moment when he was examining a plant, snatched a dagger, which was the only weapon he carried, from his belt, gave him a blow on the head, and rushing upon him, tore some of his clothes. Spamman, however, managed to rise and run towards the shore, but hampered by the bushes and briars, he was captured by the natives, who cut his hands to possess themselves of his shirt, the sleeves of which were buttoned, until he tore the wristbands with his teeth. Others of the natives, seeing him naked and half dead, gave him their clothes and conducted him to the marketplace, where there was a crowd assembled. When Spamman appeared in this plight, they all took flight without waiting to be told. Cook at first thought they intended to commit a theft. Undeceived by the appearance of the naturalist, he recalled the other natives, assured them that he would not revenge it upon the innocent, and carried his complaint straight to Orea. The latter, miserable and furious at what had occurred, loaded his people with vehement reproaches, and promised to do all in his power to find out the robbers and the stolen things. In spite of the prayers of the natives, the king embarked in the captain's vessel and entered upon a search for the culprits with him. The latter had removed their clothes, and for a while it was impossible to recognize them. Orea therefore accompanied Cook on board, dined with him, and on his return to land was received by his people, who had not expected his return, with lively expressions of joy. One of the most agreeable reflections suggested by this voyage, says Forster, is that instead of finding the inhabitants of this island plunged in voluptuousness, as had been falsely affirmed by earlier navigators, we remarked the most humane and delicate sentiments among them. There are vicious characters in every society, but we could count 50 more sinners in England or any other civilized country than in these islands. As the vessels were putting off, Orea came to announce that the robbers were taken, and to invite Cook to land and assist in their punishment. It was impossible. The king accompanied Cook half a league on his way, and left him with friendly farewells. This stay in port had been very productive. The 2 vessels brought away more than 300 pigs and quantities of fowls and fruits. Probably they would not have procured much more, even had their stay been prolonged. Captain Furneaux had agreed to take a young man named Amai on board. His conduct and intelligence gave a favorable idea of the inhabitants of the Society Islands. Upon his arrival in England, this Tahitian was presented to the king by Earl Sandwich, First Lord of the Admiralty. At the same time, he found protectors and friends in Banks and Solander. They arranged a friendly reception for him among the first families of Great Britain. He lived 2 years in this country, and upon Cook's 3rd voyage he accompanied him and returned to his native land. The captain afterwards visited Ulaiatia, where the natives gave him the most appreciative welcome. They inquired with interest about Tupia and the English they had seen in the Endeavour. King Oreo hastened to renew his acquaintance with the captain and gave him all the provisions his island produced. During their stay, Porio, who had embarked in the Resolution, landed with a young Tahitan girl who had enchanted him, and would not return on board. He was replaced by a young man of 17 or 18 years of age, a native of Balabola, named O Aditi, who announced his wish to go to England. The grief evinced by this native on leaving his native land spoke well for his good heart. The vessels, laden with more than 400 pigs, and also with fowls and fruit, left the Society Islands on the 17th of September and steered for the west. 6 days later, one of the Harvey Islands was sighted, and on the 1st of October anchor was cast off Ia, called Middleburg Island by Tasman and Cook. The welcome by the natives was cordial. A chief named Taiwan came on board, touched the captain's nose with a pinch of pepper, and sat down without speaking. The alliance was concluded and ratified by the gift of a few trifles. Taiwan guided the English into the interior. The newcomers were surrounded by a dense crowd of natives, offering stuffs and mats in exchange for nails as long as the walk lasted. The natives often even carried their liberality so far as to decline any return for these presents. Taiwan conducted his new friends to his dwelling, agreeably situated in a beautiful valley, in the shade of some sadhex. He served them with a liquor extracted from the juice of the eva, the use of which is common to the Polynesian islanders. It was prepared in the following manner. Pieces of a root, a species of pepper, were first chewed, and then placed in a large wooden vase over which water was poured. As soon as this liquor was drinkable, the natives poured it out into cups made of green leaves, shaped into form, and holding about half a pint. Cook was the only one who tasted it. The method of preparing the liquor had quenched the thirst of his companions, but the natives were not fastidious, and the vase was soon emptied. The English afterwards visited several plantations or gardens, separated by intertwined hedges, which were connected by doors formed of planks and hung upon hinges. The perfection of culture, and the fully developed instinct of property, showed a degree of civilization superior to that of Tahiti. In spite of the reception he met with, Cook, who could procure neither pigs nor fowls, left this island to reach that of Amsterdam, called Tonga Tabu by the natives. Here he hoped to find the provisions he needed. The vessel soon anchored in the roadstead of Van Diemen in 18 fathoms of water, a cable's length from the breakers which border the shore. The natives were friendly and brought stuffs, mats, implements, arms, ornaments, and soon afterwards pigs and fowls. O Aditi bought some red feathers of them with much delight, declaring they would have a high value at Tahiti. Cook landed with a native named Atago, who had attached himself to him at once. During his excursion, he remarked a temple similar to a morai, and which was called by the generic name of Feitoka. Raised upon an artificial butt, 16 or 18 feet from the ground, the temple was in an oblong form, and was reached by 2 stone staircases. Built like the homes of the natives, with posts and joists, it was covered with palm leaves. 2 wooden images coarsely carved, 2 feet in length, occupied the corners. As I did not wish to offend either them or their gods, says the captain, I dared not touch them, but I inquired of Atago if these were ituas or gods. I do not know if he understood me, but he instantly handled them and turned them over as roughly as if he had merely touched a bit of wood, which convinced me that they did not represent a divine being. A few thefts were perpetrated, but they did not interrupt cordiality, and a quantity of provisions were procured. Before leaving, the captain had an interview with a person who was treated with extraordinary respect, to whom all the natives accorded the rank of king. Cook says, I found him seated, with a gravity of deportment so stupid and so dull, that in spite of all they had told me, I took him for an idiot, whom the people adored from superstitious motives. I saluted him and talked to him, but he made no reply and paid no attention to me. I was about to leave him, when a native made me understand that it was without doubt the king. I offered him a shirt, a hatchet, a piece of red stuff, a looking-glass, some nails, metals, and glassware. He received them, or rather allowed them to be placed upon his person or beside him, losing nothing of his gravity and speaking no word, not even moving his head to the right or left. However, next day, this chief sent baskets of bananas and a roast pig, saying that it was a present from the hierarchy of the island to the hierarchy of the ship. Cook called this archipelago the Friendly Islands. They had formerly received various names from Scouten and Tasman, as Coconut Islands, Traitor Islands, Hope Islands, and Horn Islands. Cook, not having been able to obtain fresh water, was obliged to leave Tonga sooner than he wished. He found time, however, to make a few observations as to the productions of the country and the manners of the natives. We will mention the most striking. Nature had showered its treasures with a liberal hand upon Tonga and Ia Islands. Coconuts, palm trees, breadfruit trees, yams, and sugar canes are most plentiful there. As for edible animals, pigs and fowls alone were met with, but dogs, if not existing there, are known by name. The most delicate fish abounds on the coast. Of much the same form as Europeans, and equally white, the inhabitants of these islands are well proportioned and of pleasant features. Their hair is originally black, but they are in the habit of tinting it with powder, so that white, red, and blue hair abounds, which produces a singular effect. Tattooing is a universal practice. Their clothes are very simple, consisting of one piece of stuff rolled round the waist and falling to the knees. The women, who at Tonga, as everywhere else, are more coquettish than men, make aprons of coconut fibers, which they ornament with shells and bits of colored stuffs and feathers. The natives have some singular customs which the English had not noticed before. Thus they put everything that is given them on their heads and conclude a bargain with this practice. When a friend or relation dies, they slash their limbs and even some of their fingers. Their dwellings are not collected in villages, but are separate and dispersed among the plantations. Built in the same style as those of the Society Isles, they differ from them only in being raised higher above the ground. The Adventure and Resolution sailed on the 7th of October, and the following day reconnoitered Pilstart Island, discovered by Tasman. On the 21st, anchor was cast in Hawke's Bay, New Zealand. Cook landed a certain number of animals, which he wished to acclimatize, and set sail again to enter Queen Charlotte's Sound, but being caught in a great gale, he was separated from the Adventure, and did not meet her again until he reached England. On the 5th of November, the captain repaired the damages of his vessel, and before undertaking a new voyage in the southern seas, he wished to ascertain the extent and quality of his provisions. He reckoned that 4,500 pounds of biscuits had been entirely spoiled, and that more than 3,000 pounds were in scarcely better condition. During his stay here, he obtained a new and still more convincing proof of the cannibalism of the natives of New Zealand. An officer had bought the head of a young man, who had been killed and eaten, and some natives, seeing it, wished very much for a piece. Cook gave it up to them, and the avidity with which they threw themselves upon this revolting food proved the pleasure that these cannibals took in eating food which they have difficulty in procuring. The Resolution left New Zealand on the 26th of November and entered the glacial regions which she had already traversed. But the circumstances attending her second voyage were distressing. The crew, though in good health, were overcome by fatigue and less capable of resisting illness, the more so that they had no fresh food on board. The Resolution had lost her consort, and the world was convinced that no Antarctic continent existed. It was, so to say, a platonic voyage. It was necessary to prove beyond the possibility of doubt that no new land of any importance was to be discovered in these latitudes. The first ice was encountered on the 12th of December, and farther to the south than in the preceding year. From this date, the usual incidents of navigation in these latitudes were repeated day by day. Oediddy was quite astonished by the white rain, as he called the snow which fell on his hand, but the sight of the first ice was a still greater marvel to him. He called it white earth. His mind had been struck by a phenomenon in the torrid zone, says the narrative. As long as the ships remained in these latitudes, we had had scarcely any night, and he had seen that we could write at midnight by the light of the sun. Oediddy could scarcely believe his eyes, and he assured us that his fellow countrymen would put him down as a liar if he talked to them of petrified rain and of perpetual day. The young Tahitian had time to become accustomed to this phenomenon, for the ship advanced as far as 76 degrees south, amidst floating ice. Then, convinced that if a continent existed the ice made access to it impossible, Cook determined to proceed to the north. General dissatisfaction prevailed. No one on board was free from severe colds or from an attack of scurvy. The captain himself was seriously affected by bilious sickness, which kept him in bed. For 8 days his life was in danger, and his recovery was likely to be equally painful and slow. The same route was followed until the 11th of March, when with the rising of the sun the joyful cry of "Land! Land!" arose. It was the Easter Island of Rogween's Davis Land. Upon nearing it, the navigators were struck with astonishment, as the Dutch had been, by the enormous statues erected on the shore. Cook says that the latitude of Easter Island answers very closely to that marked in Rogween's Journal, and its longitude is only 1 degree wrong. The shore, composed of black broken rock of ferruginous appearance, shows traces of violent subterranean eruption. A few scattered plantations were perceived in the center of the island. Singular coincidence. The first word spoken by the natives as the strangers approached the shore was to ask in the Tahitian tongue for a rope. This again suggested that the origin of both races was the same. Like the Tahitians, they were tattooed, and clothed in stuff similar to those of the Society Islands. The action of the sun on their heads, says the narrative, has forced them to find different means for protecting themselves. The greater number of the men wear a circular head covering about 2 inches thick, twisted with grass from one side to the other, and covered with a great quantity of those long, black feathers which adorn the frigate bird. Others have enormous hats of brown gull's feathers, almost as large as the wigs of European lawyers, and many have a simple wooden hoop, surrounded with white gull's feathers which wave in the air. The women wear large and wide hats of neat plaits, which come to a point in front, with a ridge along the top, and two great lobes on either side. The country was a picture of desolation. It was surveyed by 2 detachments, and was found to be covered with black and porous stones. The entire vegetation which could thrive on this mass of lava consisted of 2 or 3 kinds of rugose grass, which grew on the rocks, scanty bushes, especially the paper mulberry, the hibiscus, and the mimosa, and some plantains. Close to the landing place is a perpendicular wall, constructed of square stones, compactly and durably joined in accordance with art rules, and fitting in a style of durability. Further on, in the center of a well-paved area, a monolith is erected, representing a half-naked human figure, some 21 feet high and more than 5 wide, very roughly hewn. The head is badly designed, the eyes, nose, and mouth scarcely indicated, but the ears are very long, as is the fashion in this country, and are better finished than the rest. One in the earlier editions of the French translation of Cook's Voyages, Paris, 1878, 7-4 to Vols. The height of this statue is given as 2 feet, evidently by a typographical error. We now correct this mistake, which has been repeated in all subsequent editions. These monuments, which are numerous, do not appear to have been erected or hewn by the race the English found, or this race had degenerated. For these natives paid no respect to the statues, although they treated them with a certain veneration, and objected to anyone's walking on the pavement near them. It was not only on the seashore that these enormous sentinels were seen. Between the mountains, in the fissures of rocks, others existed, some erect or fallen to earth through some convulsion, others still imperfectly separated from the block from which they were being cut. What sudden catastrophe stopped the works? What do these monoliths represent? To what distant period do these testimonies of the industry of a race long disappeared, or the recollection of whom has perished, seem to point? This problem must remain forever insoluble. Monuments in Easter Island. Monuments in Easter Island. Facsimile of early engraving. Traffic proceeded easily. It was only necessary to repress the marvelous dexterity of the natives in emptying pockets. The few possessions which had been obtained had been very useful, though the want of drinkable water prevented Cook remaining long in Easter Island. He directed his course to the archipelago of the Marquesas of Mendana, which had not been visited since 1595. But his vessel had no sooner been put to sea than he was again attacked by the bilious fever, from which he had suffered so severely. The sufferers from scurvy relapsed, and all who had undertaken long walks across Easter Island had their faces burnt by the sun. Natives of Easter Island. Natives of Easter Island. Facsimile of early engraving. On the 7th of April, 1774, Cook sighted the Marquesas group, after seeking them in vain for 5 consecutive days in the different positions assigned to them by geographers. Anchor was cast at Tauwadi, the Santa Cristina of Mendana. The Resolution was soon surrounded by pirogues, the foremost of which was full of stones, every man on board having a sling round his hand. However, friendly relations were formed, followed by barter. These natives, says Forster, are well made, with handsome faces, yellowish or tan complexions, and marks all over their bodies, which gives them an almost black appearance. The valleys of our harbor were filled with trees, and tallied in every particular with the description given by the Spaniards. We saw fire across the forests several times, very far from the shore, and concluded that the country was well populated. Natives of the Marquesas. Natives of the Marquesas. The difficulty of procuring food decided Cook upon a hasty departure, but he had time to collect some interesting facts about the people, whom he considered the handsomest in Oceania. These natives appear to surpass all others in the regularity of their features. The resemblance in their speech, however, to that of the Tahitans, appears to point to a common origin. The Marquesas are 5 in number: Magdalena, San Pedro, Dominica, Santa Cristina, and Hood Island, the latter so called after the volunteer who first discovered it. Santa Cristina is divided by a chain of mountains of considerable elevation, to which the hills that rise from the sea lead. Deep, narrow, and fertile valleys, filled with fruit trees and watered by streams of excellent water, intersect this mountain isle. Port Mater de Dios, called by Cook Resolution Harbor, is about the center of the eastern coast of Santa Cristina. It contains two sandy creeks, into which two streams flow. Chapter 2. A fresh visit to Tahiti and the Friendly Islands, exploration of New Hebrides, discovery of New Caledonia and Pine Island, stay in Queen Charlotte Sound, South Georgia, accident to the adventure. After leaving these islands on the 12th of April and sailing for Tahiti, Cook fell in, 5 days later, with the Paumotu archipelago. He landed on the Taukia island of Byron. The inhabitants, who had cause to complain of earlier navigators, received the advances of the English coldly. The latter could only obtain about 24 coconuts and 5 pigs, which appeared plentiful in this island. In another settlement, a more friendly reception was met with. The natives embraced the newcomers and rubbed their noses in the same fashion as the New Zealanders. Edidi bought several dogs, the long and white hair of whose skins serves as an ornament for cuirasses in his native land. Forster relates, "The natives told us that they broke up scurvy grass, mixed it with shellfish, and threw it into the sea on the approach of a shoal of fish. This bait intoxicated the fish for a time, and when they came to the surface it was easy to take them. The captain afterwards saw several other islands of this immense archipelago, which were similar to those he had left, especially the Pernicious Islands, where Rogwin had lost his sloop, the African, and to which Cook gave the name of Palliser Islands. He then steered for Tahiti, which the sailors, certain of the goodwill of the natives, regarded as a home. The Resolution cast anchor in Matavai Bay on the 22nd of April, and their reception was as friendly as had been anticipated. A few days later, King Otu and several other chiefs visited the English, and brought them a present of 10 or a dozen large pigs and some fruit. Cook's first idea was to remain in this spot only just long enough for Mr. Wales, the astronomer, to take observations, but the abundance of provisions induced him to prolong his stay. On the morning of the 26th, the captain, who had been to Opry with some of his officers to make a formal visit to the king, observed a fleet of more than 300 pirogues drawn up in order on the shore. They were all completely equipped. At the same time, a number of warriors assembled on the beach. The officers' suspicions were excited by this formidable armament, collected in one night, but they were reassured by the welcome they received. This fleet consisted of no less than 60 large double pirogues, decorated with flags and streamers, and smaller ones, intended for the transport of provisions, and the flotilla was manned with no fewer than 77-60 men, warriors or paddlers. The sight of this fleet, says Forster, increased our ideas of the power and wealth of this island. The entire crew was astonished. When we reflect upon the implements possessed by this people, we can but admire the patience and toil necessary to cut down these enormous trees, separate and polish the branches, and then to carry the heavy constructions to such perfection. These works are produced by them by means of a stone hatchet and saw, a piece of coral, and the hide of whales. The chiefs and all who occupied a prominent fighting rank were dressed in military style. That is to say, in a quantity of stuffs, turbans, helmets, and breastplates. The height of some of the helmets was most embarrassing to the wearers. The entire equipment appeared more appropriate for scenic effect than suitable for a battlefield. But in any case, it added to the grandeur of the display, and the warriors did not fail to show themselves with a view to the most striking effect. Upon reaching Matavai, Cook learned that this formidable armament was destined for an attack upon Aimeo, whose chief had revolted against the Tahitan yoke and become independent. During the following days, the captain was visited by some of his old friends. All showed a desire to possess red feathers, which were of considerable value. One only attached more importance to a glass bead or a nail. The Tahitans were so impressed that they offered in exchange the strange mourning garments, which they had refused to sell during Cook's first voyage. These garments are made of the rarest productions of the islands and the surrounding sea, and are worked with care and great skill, and no doubt are of great value to themselves. We bought no less than 10, which we brought to England. Oedidi, who had taken good care to procure some feathers for himself, could indulge in any caprice he liked. The natives looked upon him as a prodigy and listened eagerly to his tales. The principal personages of the island, and even the king, sought his society. He married a daughter of the chief of Matavai and brought his wife on board. Everyone was delighted to make him a present. Finally, he decided to remain at Tahiti, where he had found his sister married to a powerful chief. In spite of the thefts, which more than once caused unpleasantness, the English procured more provisions on their stay in this port than ever before. The aged Obria, who was like a queen in the island during the stay made by the Dauphin in 1767, herself brought pigs and fruits, in the secret hope of obtaining red feathers, which had so great a success. Presents were liberally given, and the Indians were amused with fireworks and military maneuvers. Just before he left, the captain witnessed a curious naval review. O2 ordered a sham fight, but it lasted so short a time that it was impossible to observe the movements. The fleet was to commence hostilities 5 days after Cook's departure, and he would much have liked to have waited for it. But, fearing the natives might suspect him of an attempt to overcome both conquered and victors, he determined to leave. The Resolution had scarcely left the bay, when one of the gunners, seduced by the delights of Tahiti, and possibly by the promises of King O2, who, no doubt, thought a European might be of use to him, threw himself into the sea, but he was soon retaken by a boat launched by Cook in his pursuit. Cook very much regretted the fact that discipline obliged him to act in this way. The man had no relations or friends in England, and, had he requested permission to remain in Tahiti, it would not have been refused. On the 15th, the Resolution anchored in Owar Harbor, in Huhine Island. The old chief Oria was one of the first to congratulate the English upon their return, and to bring them presents. The captain presented him with red feathers, but the old chief appeared to prefer iron, hatchets, and nails. He seemed more indolent than upon the previous visit. His head was weaker, no doubt owing to his immoderate love for an intoxicating drink extracted from pepper by the natives. His authority was evidently despised, and Cook sent in pursuit of a band of robbers, who had not refrained from pillaging the old king himself, and who had taken refuge in the center of the island. Oria showed himself grateful for the consideration the English had always shown him. He was the last to leave the vessel before she sailed, on the 24th of April, and when Cook said that they should never meet again, he shed tears and replied, "Send your children here, we will treat them well." On another occasion, Oria asked the captain where he should be buried. "At Stepney," said Cook. Oria begged him to repeat the word until he could pronounce it. Then 100 voices cried at once, "Stepney Morai no toot, Stepney the grave of Cook." In giving this reply, the great navigator had no prevision of his fate, or of the difficulty his fellow countrymen would have in finding his remains. O Edidi, who at the last moment had accompanied the English to Huahine, had not met with so cordial a welcome as at Tahiti. His riches had strangely diminished, and his credit suffered in consequence. The narrative says, "He soon proved the truth of the proverb that a man is never a prophet in his own country. He left us with regrets which proved his esteem for us, and when the moment of separation arrived, he ran from cabin to cabin embracing everyone. It is impossible to describe the mental anguish of the young man when he left. He gazed at the vessel, burst into tears, and crouched in despair in the bottom of his pirogue. We saw him again, stretching out his arms to us as we left the reefs." Cook reconnoitered Hove Island, so called by Wallis, on the 6th of June. It is named Mohipa by the natives. A few days later, he found several uninhabited islets, surrounded by a chain of breakers, to which he gave the name of Palmerston, in honor of one of the lords of the Admiralty. Upon the 20th, a steep and rocky island was discovered, crowned with large woods and bushes. The beach was narrow and sandy, and several natives of very dark complexion were seen upon it. They made menacing demonstrations, and were armed with lances and clubs. As soon as the English landed, they retired. Champions, however, advanced and endeavored to provoke the strangers, assailing them with a storm of arrows and stones. Spamman was wounded in the arm, and Cook just escaped being struck by a javelin. A general volley soon dispersed these inhospitable islanders, and the uncivil reception which was thus accorded well deserved the name bestowed upon their land of Savage Island. 4 days later, Cook reached the Tonga archipelago once more. He stopped this time at Namauka, called Rotterdam by Tasman. He had scarcely cast anchor before the ship was surrounded by a crowd of pirogues, filled with bananas and every kind of fruit, which were exchanged for nails and old pieces of stuff. This friendly reception encouraged the naturalists to land and penetrate to the interior, in search of new plants and unknown productions. Upon their return, they enlarged upon the beauty of this picturesque and romantic country, and upon the affability and cordiality of the natives. In spite of it, however, various thefts continued to take place, until a more important larceny than usual obliged the captain to resort to severity. a native who opposed the seizure of two pirogues by the English as hostages until the stolen arms were restored, was wounded severely by a gunshot. During this second visit, Cook bestowed the name of Friendly Islands upon this group, no doubt with a sarcastic meaning. Nowadays, they are better known by the native name of Tonga. The indefatigable navigator continued his route in a westward direction, passed in succession Lepru, Aurora, Whitsunday, and Malikalo Islands, to which archipelago Bougainville had given the name of the Grand Cyclades. Cook gave his usual order to enter into friendly and commercial relations with the inhabitants. The first day passed quietly, and the natives celebrated the visit of the English by games and dancing. But on the morrow, an incident occurred which led to a general collision. A native who was refused access to the ship prepared to launch an arrow at one of the sailors. His fellow countrymen at first prevented him. At the same moment, Cook appeared on deck, his gun in his hand. His first step was to shout to the native, who again aimed at the sailor. Without replying, the native was about to let his arrow fly at him, when a shot anticipated and wounded him. This was the signal for a general discharge of arrows, which struck on the vessel and did but little damage. Cook then ordered a gun to be fired over the natives' heads with a view to dispersing them. A few hours later, the natives again surrounded the ship and returned to their barter as if nothing had happened. Cook took advantage of these friendly indications to land an armed detachment for wood and water. 4 or 5 natives were collected on the beach. A chief, leaving the group, advanced to the captain, holding in his hand, as Cook also did, a green bough. The 2 branches were exchanged, and peace thus concluded. A few slight presents helped to cement it. Cook then obtained permission to take wood, but not to go far from the shore, and the naturalists, who were anxious to prosecute their investigations in the interior, were brought back to the beach, in spite of their protestations. Iron implements had no value for these people. This made it extremely difficult to obtain provisions. Only a few agreed to exchange arms for stuffs and exhibited an honesty in their transactions to which the English were unaccustomed. The exchanges continued after the Resolution had set sail, and the natives hurried in their pirogues to deliver the articles for which they had received the price. One of them, after vigorous efforts, succeeded in gaining the vessels, carrying his weapons to a sailor who had paid for them and forgotten it. It was so long ago. The native refused the recompense the sailor would have given, making him understand that he had been paid already. Cook gave the name of Port Sandwich to this harbor of refuge, which he left on the morning of the 23rd of July. He was most favorably impressed by the moral qualities of the natives of Malikalo, but by no means so in regard to their physical powers. Small and badly proportioned, bronze in color, with flat faces, they were hideous. Had Darwinian theories been in vogue in those days, no doubt Cook would have recognized in them that missing link between man and monkey, which is the despair of Darwin's followers. Their coarse, crinkly black hair was short, and their bushy beards did not add to their beauty. But the one thing which made them most grotesque was their habit of tying a cord tightly across the stomach, which made them appear like great emmets. Tortoiseshell earrings, bracelets made of hog's teeth, large tortoiseshell rings, and a white flat stone which they passed through the cartilage of the nose, constituted their ornaments. Their weapons were bows and arrows, spears and clubs. The points of their arrows, which were occasionally 2 or 3 in number, were coated with a substance which the English thought was poisonous, from observing the care with which the natives drew them out of a kind of quiver. The Resolution had only just left Port Sandwich when all the crew were seized with colic, vomiting, and violent pains in the head and back. 2 large fish had been caught and eaten by them, possibly whilst they were under the influence of the narcotic mentioned above. In every case, 10 days elapsed before entire recovery. A parrot and dog which had also eaten of the fish died next day. Quiro's companions had suffered in the same way, and since Cook's voyage similar symptoms of poisoning have been noticed in these latitudes. After leaving Malikalo, Cook steered for Ambrim Island, which appeared to contain a volcano, and shortly afterwards discovered a group of small islands, which he named Shepherd Islands, in honor of the Cambridge professor of astronomy. He then visited the islands of Two Hills, Montagu and Hinchinbrook Islands, and the largest of all, Sandwich Island, which must not be mistaken for the group of the same name. All the islands, lying among and protected by breakers, were covered with rich vegetation and were largely populated. Typical natives of the Sandwich Islands. Typical natives of the Sandwich Islands. Facsimile of early engraving. Two slight accidents interrupted the calm on board. A fire broke out, which was soon extinguished, and one of the sailors falling overboard was at once rescued. Coromango was discovered on the 3rd of August. Next day, Cook reached its shore, hoping to find a watering place and facility for landing. The greater part of the sufferers from the poisonous fish had not yet recovered their health, and they looked forward to its speedy re-establishment on shore. But the reception accorded to them by the natives, who were armed with clubs, lances, and arrows, seemed wanting in sincerity. Cook was on his guard. Finding that they could not lure the English into landing, the natives endeavored to force them. A chief and several men tried to snatch the oars from the sailors. Cook wished to fire his musket, but the priming would not go off. The English were immediately overwhelmed with stones and arrows. The captain at once ordered a general volley. Fortunately, half of the shots missed, or the slaughter would have been terrific. Forster says, "These natives appear to be of different race to those living in Mallicolo. They speak a different language. They are of medium height, but well-shaped, and their features are not disagreeable. They were bronze in complexion, and they paint their faces black or red. Their hair is somewhat woolly and curly. The few women I saw appeared very ugly. I have seen no pirogues on any part of the coast. They live in houses covered with palm leaves, and their plantations are in straight lines and are surrounded by a hedge of reeds." It was useless to make a second attempt to land. Cook, having bestowed the name of Cape Traitor upon the scene of the collision, reached an island, which he had seen the previous evening, and which the natives called Tana. The highest hill of the same range is of conical shape, says Forster, with a crater in the center. It is reddish-brown and composed of a mass of burnt stones, perfectly sterile. From time to time it emitted a thick column of smoke like a great tree, increasing in width as it ascended. The Resolution was at once surrounded by a score of pirogues, the largest of which contained 25 men. The latter sought to appropriate everything within their reach: buoys, flags, the hinges of the rudder, which they tried to knock off. They only returned to the shore after a 4-pounder had been fired over their heads. The vessel made for the shore, but all the trifles that were distributed could not induce the natives to relinquish their attitude of defiance and bravado. It was clear that the smallest misunderstanding would lead to bloodshed. Cook imagined these people to be cannibals, although pigs, fowls, roots, and fruits abounded. During the stay, prudence prevented anyone leaving the shore. Forster, however, ventured a little way and discovered a spring of water, so hot that he could not hold his finger in it longer than a second. In spite of all their wishes, the English found it impossible to reach the central volcano, which emitted torrents of fire and smoke as high as the clouds, and projected enormously large stones into the air. The number of extinct volcanoes in every direction was considerable, and the soil was decidedly subject to volcanic eruptions. By degrees, though without losing their reserve, the Tanians became more at home with the strangers, and intercourse was less difficult. "These people," says Cook, "showed themselves hospitable, civil, and good-hearted, when we did not excite their jealousy. We cannot blame their conduct greatly, for after all, from what point of view can they have judged us? They could not possibly know our real intentions. We entered their country, as they dared not oppose us. We endeavored to disembark as friends, but we landed and maintained our superiority by force of arms. Under such circumstances, what opinion could the natives form of us? It doubtless appeared far more plausible that we came to invade their country than that we visited them as friends. Time only, and intimate relations, could teach them our good intentions." However that might be, the English were at a loss to guess why the natives prevented their penetrating to the interior of the country. Was it owing to a naturally shy nature? Or possibly because they were threatened with constant inroads from their neighbors? Their address in the use of arms and their bearing supported this idea, but it was impossible to know with any certainty. As the natives did not value anything the English offered, they did not bring any great quantity of the fruits and roots the latter longed for. They would not consent to part with their pigs even for hatchets, the utility of which they had proved. The productions of the island included breadfruits, coconuts, a fruit like a peach, called par, yams, potatoes, wild pigs, nutmegs, and many others of which Forster did not know the names. On the 21st, Cook left Tana, discovered successively Aramam and Anatum Islands, and coasted Sandwich Island. He passed Mallicolo and Quiros Land of the Holy Spirit, where he easily recognized St. James and St. Philip Bays, and left this archipelago after having named it New Hebrides, by which appellation it is now known. A new discovery was made on the 5th of September. No European foot had ever trodden the soil he now sighted. It was the northern extremity of New Caledonia. The first point recognized was called Cape Colnet, after one of the volunteers who saw it first. The coast was bordered by a chain of breakers, behind which 2 or 3 pirogues appeared to be paddling, so as to reconnoiter the newcomers. But at sunrise they brailed their sails and were seen no more. Having cruised for 2 hours along the outer reefs, Cook perceived an opening which he thought would enable him to draw near. He steered for it and landed at Balade. The country appeared sterile and uniformly covered with a whitish grass. Some trees with white trunks, like the willow in shape, were seen here and there. They were nyoles. At the same time, several houses like beehives were perceived. No sooner was anchor cast than 15 or more pirogues surrounded the vessel. The natives had sufficient confidence to approach and begin traffic. Some of them even entered the ship and inspected all the various parts of it with extreme curiosity. They refused to touch the dishes offered them, stewed peas, beef, and salt pork, but they voluntarily tasted the yams. They were most surprised at the goats, pigs, dogs, and cats, which were so strange to them that they had no words to designate them. Nails, all iron implements, and red stuffs appeared precious to them. Tall, strong, and well-proportioned, with curly hair and beard, and of dark chocolate color, they spoke a language which bore no resemblance to any which the English had hitherto heard. The natives had sufficient confidence. The natives had sufficient confidence. When the captain landed, he was received with joyful demonstrations, and with the surprise natural to people who are brought face to face with objects of which they have had no previous idea. Some of the chiefs, enjoining silence, made short harangues, and Cook began the usual distribution of ironmongery and hardware. His officers mixed with the crowd to make observations. Many of the natives appeared afflicted with a kind of leprosy, and their arms and legs were greatly swollen. They were all but naked, wearing merely a cord tightened to the figure, from which hung scraps of stuff made from the fig tree. A few wore enormous cylindrical hats, open on 2 sides, like the hats of the Hungarian hussars. They hung tortoise-shell earrings or rolls of the leaves of the sugar-cane in their ears, which were pulled out and split. The English soon perceived a little village above the mangroves which bordered the shore. It was surrounded by sugar-cane plantations, yams, and banana trees, and watered by little canals, cleverly diverted from the large river. Cook soon discovered that he need expect nothing of this race but permission to survey the country. These natives, he says, taught us a few words of their language, which bore no resemblance to that of any other tribe. They were mild and peaceable in character, but extremely lazy. If we addressed them, they replied, but if we continued our way, seldom joined us in our excursions. If we passed their cabins without remark, they took no notice of us. The women were slightly more curious, and hid themselves in the bushes to look after us, but they would only approach in the company of the men. They appeared neither vexed nor alarmed when we shot birds. Indeed, if we were near their huts, the young people would point them out to us, for the pleasure of seeing us fire. They appeared to have very little to do at this time of year. Having tilled the ground and sown roots and bananas, they awaited their crops next summer. Perhaps in this fact lay the explanation of their having no provisions to offer in traffic, for in other respects, we found them fully alive to the hospitable instinct, which more particularly commends the islanders of the southern seas to navigators. Cook's assertion of the indolence of the New Caledonians is perfectly true, but his stay amongst them was too short to enable him to appreciate their character thoroughly, and he certainly never suspected that they indulged in the horrible practice of cannibalism. He noticed no birds living in a wild state there excepting quails, turtle doves, pigeons, turkeys, ducks, teal, and a few smaller ones. He could not ascertain the presence of any quadrupeds, and he entirely failed in his endeavors to procure provisions. At Balade the captain made several excursions into the interior, and climbed the mountains to gain a general view over the country. From the summit of a rock, he clearly saw the 2 coasts, and ascertained that New Caledonia in this part was only 10 leagues in width. In its general features, the country resembled various portions of New Holland, which is in the same latitude. The productions of both appear to be the same, and there is an absence of brushwood in the forests of both. Cook also observed the presence of minerals on the hills, and his discovery has been verified in late years by the proved existence of gold, iron, copper, coal, and nickel. A few of the crew met with a similar adventure, here to that which had been almost fatal to some of them, in the neighborhood of Malicolo. Cook relates it thus: "My secretary bought a fish which had been harpooned by a native, and sent it to me on board. This fish was of an entirely new species and resembled that known as sunfish. It was of the order called Tetrodon by Lin O's. Its head was hideous, wide, and long. Never suspecting that it might be poisonous, I ordered it to be served at table the same evening. Fortunately, so much time was consumed in drawing and describing it that no time was left for the cooking, and only the liver was served. The two Forsters and myself partook of it, and towards 3 in the morning we experienced a sensation of weakness and want of power in our limbs. I all but lost the sense of touch, and could no longer distinguish light from heavy objects when I desired to move them. A pot full of water and a feather appeared to me equally heavy. We first resorted to emetics, and afterwards we succeeded in inducing perspiration, which relieved us greatly. In the morning, a pig which had eaten the entrails of the fish was found dead. When the natives came on board and saw the fish hanging up, they made us understand that it was unwholesome. They showed their disgust of it, but neither in selling it, or even after having been paid for it, had they given the slightest hint of such aversion. Cook next proceeded to the survey of the greater part of the eastern coast. During this excursion, he met with a native as white as a European. His complexion was attributed to illness. This man was an albino, like those already met with in Tahiti and the Society Islands. The captain was anxious to acclimatize pigs in New Caledonia, but he had the greatest difficulty in inducing the natives to accept a hog and a sow. He was forced to insist upon their usefulness, the facility of breeding them, and to exaggerate their value before the natives would consent to their being landed. Cook describes the New Caledonians as tall, robust, active, polite, and peaceable. He gives them the rare character of honesty. But his successors in this country, more especially 500 Entrecasto, discovered to their detriment that they did not preserve this quality. Some of them had the thick lips, flat nose, and general appearance of the Negro. Their naturally curly hair added to the resemblance. If I were to guess, says Cook, at the origin of this people, I should take them to be an intermediate race between the people of Tanna and the Friendly Islands, or between those of Tanna and New Zealand, or possibly between all three, for their language is in some respects a sort of mixture of that of these different countries. The frequency of war amongst them is indicated by the number of their offensive weapons: clubs, spears, lances, slings, javelins, and see, the stones used for their slings are smooth and oval. Their houses are built on a circular plan, most of them being like beehives with the roof of considerable height and terminating in a point. They always have one or two fires alight, but as there is only one outlet for the smoke, through the doorway, no European could live in them. With the roof of considerable height, with the roof of considerable height, they subsisted entirely upon fish and roots, such as yams and the bark of a tree, which was but little succulent. Bananas, sugar canes, and breadfruit were rare, and coconuts did not flourish so well as in the island previously visited by the English. The number of inhabitants appeared considerable, but Cook justly remarked that his arrival had brought about a general reunion of all the tribes, and Lieutenant Pickersgill decided during his hydrographical excursions that the country was sparsely populated. The New Caledonians buried their dead. Many of the crew visited their cemeteries, and especially the tomb of a chief, which was a kind of mound, decorated with spears, javelins, arrows, and darts, which were stuck around it. Cook left the harbor of Balade and continued to coast New Caledonia without finding fresh provisions. The aspect of the country was universally sterile, but quite to the south of this large land, a smaller one was discovered, to which the name of Pine Island was given, on account of the number of pine trees upon it. They were a species of Prussian pine, very appropriate for the spars needed for the Resolution. Cook accordingly sent a sloop and some men to choose and cut the trees he needed. Some of them were 20 inches in diameter and 70 feet high, so that a mast could have been formed of one had it been needed. The discovery of this island had a certain value, as, with the exception of New Zealand, it was the only one in the entire Pacific Ocean which produced wood fit for masts and poles. In steering southwards towards New Zealand, Cook sighted a small, uninhabited island on the 10th of October, upon which the botanists reaped a plentiful harvest of unknown vegetables. It was Norfolk Island, so named in honor of the Howard family. It was afterwards colonized by a part of the mutineers of the Bounty. The Resolution anchored again in Queen Charlotte's Sound. The gardens so anxiously planted by the English had been entirely neglected by the New Zealanders, but in spite of this several plants had grown marvelously. The natives were very shy of appearing at first, and seemed to care little for any intercourse with the strangers, but when they recognized their old friends, they testified their delight most extravagantly. When asked why they had been so reserved at first, they evaded a reply, and there was no doubt that they were thinking of murder and combats. This aroused Cook's apprehensions for the fate of the adventure, of which he had heard nothing since his last stay in this port, but he could obtain no reply to the questions he put. He was only to learn what had occurred in his absence, when he reached the Cape of Good Hope and found letters from Captain Furneaux. After once more landing some pigs, with which he wished to endow New Zealand, the captain set sail for Cape Horn on the 10th of November. After a vain cruise, he at last sighted the eastern shore of Tierra del Fuego, near the entrance to the Straits of Magellan. The portion of America which now met our view, says Cook, was dreary enough. It seemed to be cut up into small islands, which, though by no means high, were very black and almost entirely barren. In the background, we saw high ground covered with snow, almost to the water's edge. It is the wildest shore I have ever seen, and appears entirely composed of mountains and rocks without a vestige of vegetation. The mountains overhang horrible precipices, the sharp peaks of which arise to great height. Probably there is nothing in nature which presents so wild an appearance. The interior mountains are covered with snow, but those bordering the sea are not. We imagine the former to belong to Tierra del Fuego, and the latter to be ranged over the small islands in such a way as to present the appearance of an uninterrupted coast. The captain still thought it better to remain some time in this desolate region, to procure fresh victuals for his crew. He found safe anchorage in Christmas Sound, where, as usual, he made a careful hydrographical survey. View of Christmas Sound. View of Christmas Sound. Several birds were shot, and Mr. Pickerskill brought 300 seagulls' eggs and 14 geese on board. I was thus enabled, says Cook, to distribute them to the entire crew, a fact which gave the greater satisfaction as it was near Christmas. Without this timely supply, they must have contented themselves with beef and salt pork. Some of the natives, belonging to the nation called Pecherais by Bougainville, came on board without any pressing. Cook's description of these savages recalls that of the French explorer. They preferred the oily portions of the flesh of the seals upon which they lived, a taste which Cook attributed to the fact that the oil warmed their blood and enabled them to resist the intense cold. If, he adds, the superiority of a civilized to a savage life could ever be called in question, a single glance at one of these Indians would be sufficient to settle the question. Until it is proved that a man perpetually tortured by the rigor of a climate is happy, I shall never give in to the eloquent declamations of those philosophers who have never had the opportunity of observing human nature in all its phases, or who have not felt what they have seen. The Resolution at once set sail and doubled Cape Horn. The Strait of Le Maire was then crossed, and Staten Island reconnoitered. Here a good anchorage was found. Quantities of whales abound in these latitudes. It was now their pairing season, and seals and sea lions, penguins and garnets appeared in shoals. Dr. Sparman and myself, says Forster, narrowly escaped being attacked by one of these sea monsters, upon a rock where several of them were assembled, appearing to wait the upshot of the struggle. The doctor had fired at a bird and stooped to pick it up when the sea lion growled and, showing his tusks, seemed disposed to attack my companion. From where I was posted, I shot the animal stark dead, and at the report of my gun the herd, seeing their companion fall, fled along the coast. Several of them threw themselves into the sea with such haste that they jumped 10 or 15 roods straight upon the pointed rocks. But I do not think they hurt themselves much, for their skin is very hard and their fat is so elastic that it is easily compressed. After leaving Staten Island, Cook set sail on the 3rd of January, for the southeast, to explore the only part of the ocean which had hitherto escaped him. He soon reached southern Georgia, seen in 1675 by Laroche, and again by M. Guillot Duclos in 1756, when in command of the Spanish vessel the Leon. This discovery was made on the 14th of January, 1775. The captain landed in 3 places and took possession in the name of King George Roman III, of England, bestowing his name upon the newly found country. Possession Bay is bordered by pointed rocks of ice, exactly similar to those which had been met with in the high southern latitudes. The interior of the country, says the narrative, is no less savage and frightful. The summits of the rocks are lost in the clouds, and the valleys are covered with perpetual snow. Not a tree or even the smallest shrub is to be seen. After leaving Georgia, Cook penetrated further to the southeast, amidst floating ice. The continual dangers of the voyage overcame the crew. Southern Thule, Saunders Island, and Chandeleur Islands, and finally Sandwich Land were discovered. These sterile and deserted archipelagos have no value for the merchant or geographer. Once certain of their existence, it was unnecessary to remain, for to do so was to risk in exploring them the valuable records the Resolution was taking to England. Cook was convinced by the discovery of these isolated islands that near the pole there is a stretch of land, where the greater part of the floating ice spread over this vast southern ocean is formed. This ingenious theory has been confirmed in every particular by the explorers of the 19th century. After another fruitless search for Cape Circumcision, mentioned by Bouvet, Cook decided to regain the Cape of Good Hope, and he arrived there on the 22nd of March, 1775. The Adventure had put into this port, where Captain Furneaux had left a letter relating all that had happened in New Zealand. Captain Furneaux arrived in Queen Charlotte's Sound on the 13th of November, 1773, and took in wood and water. He then sent one of his boats under Lieutenant Rowe to gather edible plants. As the lieutenant did not return on board either in the evening or the next morning, Captain Furneaux, feeling sure that an accident had happened, sent in search of him. The following is a short account of what he learned. After various useless searchings, the officer in command of the sloop came upon some traces, as he landed upon the shore near Grass Creek. Portions of a boat and some shoes, one of which had belonged to an officer of the watch, were found. A sailor at the same time noticed a piece of fresh meat, which was taken to be the flesh of a dog, for it was not known then that the people of the place were cannibals. We opened, says Furneaux, about 8 baskets which we found on the beach tightly corded. Some were full of roast flesh and others of roots used by the natives for bread. Continuing our search, we found more shoes and a hand which we recognized as that of Thomas Hill, because TH was tattooed upon it in the Tahitian fashion. At a short distance, an officer perceived 4 pirogues and a number of natives, assembled round a large fire. The English landed and fired a regular volley, which put the Zealanders to flight, with the exception of 2, who left with the greatest sang-froid. One of them was severely wounded, and the sailors advanced up the beach. A frightful scene was soon presented before our eyes. We saw the heads, hearts, and lungs of many of the crew upon the sands, and at a little distance dogs were devouring the entrails. The officer had not a sufficient force with him, being backed by only 10 men, to meet this fearful massacre with fitting vengeance. The weather, too, became bad, and the savages collected in large numbers. It was necessary to regain the Adventure. I do not believe, says Captain Furneaux, that this butchery was premeditated on the part of the natives, for in the morning Mr. Rowe said that he observed 2 vessels pass us, and remain all the forenoon in sight of the ship. The bloodshed was most likely the result of a quarrel which was instantly fought out, or possibly as our men took no measures for their own safety, their want of caution tempted the Indians. The natives, having heard one discharge, were encouraged by observing that a gun was not an infallible instrument, that it sometimes missed fire, and that once fired it was necessary to reload before firing again. In this fearful ambuscade, the Adventure lost 10 of her best sailors. Furneaux left New Zealand on the 23rd of December, 1773, doubled Cape Horn, put into the Cape of Good Hope, and reached England on the 14th of July, 1774. After Cook had taken in provisions and repaired his vessel, he left False Bay on the 27th of May, put into St. Helena, Ascension Island, and Fernando de Noronha at Fale, one of the Azores, and finally at Plymouth on the 29th of July, 1775. During his voyage of 3 years and 18 days, he had only lost 4 men, that is to say, without reckoning the 10 sailors who were massacred at New Zealand. No former expedition had reaped such a harvest of discoveries and hydrographical, physical, and ethnological observations. The learned and ingenious investigations pursued by Cook elucidated many of the difficulties of earlier navigators. He made various important discoveries, amongst others, that of New Caledonia and Easter Island. The non-existence of an Antarctic continent was definitely ascertained. The great navigator received the fitting reward of his labors almost immediately. He was nominated ship's captain 9 days after his landing, and was elected a member of the Royal Society of London on the 29th of February, 1776. Chapter 5. Captain Cook's Third Voyage. 1. Search for the lands discovered by the French, Kerguelen Islands, stay at Van Diemen's Land, Queen Charlotte's Strait, Palmerston Island, grand rejoicings in the Tonga Islands. At this date, the idea which had sent so many explorers to Greenland was in full force. The question of the existence of a northern passage between the Atlantic and the Pacific, by way of the Asiatic or American coasts, was eagerly discussed. And should such a passage exist, was it practicable for ships? The attempt had quite lately been made to discover this outlet in Hudson or Baffin Bays, and it was now determined to seek it in the Pacific. The task was an arduous one. The Lords of the Admiralty felt that it was essential to send out a navigator who had experience of the dangers of the polar seas, and one who had shown presence of mind in the face of danger. One, moreover, whose talents, experience, and scientific knowledge might be of use in the powerful equipment then in course of preparation. In Captain Cook alone were all the requisite qualities to be found. The command was offered to him, and although he might have passed the remainder of his days in peace at his post in the Greenwich Observatory, in the full enjoyment of the honor and glory he had gained by his 2 voyages round the world, he did not hesitate for a moment. 2 ships, the Resolution and the Discovery, were placed under his command. The latter was under the orders of Captain Clerke, and the equipment of both was similar to that of the last expedition. The instructions given to the commander of the expedition enjoined his reaching the Cape of Good Hope and steering south in search of the islands recently discovered by the French, in 48 degrees of latitude, towards the meridian of the island of Mauritius. He was then to touch at New Zealand, if he thought well, to take in refreshments at the Society Islands, and to land the Tahitian Mai there. Then to proceed to New Albion, to avoid landing in any of the Spanish possessions in America, and from thence to make his way by the Arctic Ocean to Hudson and Baffin Bays. In other words, he was to look in an easterly direction for the Northwest Passage. This once effected, after a stay at Kamchatka, he was to make another attempt to reach England by the route he might judge most productive of good results for geography and navigation. The 2 vessels did not start together. The Resolution set sail from Plymouth on the 12th of July, 1776, and was rejoined at the Cape by the Discovery on the 10th of the following November, she having left England only on the 1st of August. The 2 ships were detained at the Cape until the 30th of November by the repairs needed by the Discovery. Much damaged by tempest, she required calking. The captain profited by this long delay to buy live stock, which he intended to land at Tahiti and New Zealand, and also to stock his vessels with the necessary stores for a 2 years' voyage. After steering southwards for 12 days, 2 islands were discovered in 46 degrees 53 south latitude and degrees 46 east longitude. The strait which separates them was crossed, and it was found that their steep sterile coasts were uninhabited. They had been discovered with 4 others, from 9 to 12 degrees further east, by the French captains Marion Duffresne and Crozet in 1772. On the 24th of December, Cook found the islands which M. de Kerguelen had surveyed in his 2 voyages of 1772, 1773. Kerguelen Islands. Kerguelen Islands. We will not here relate the observations made by Cook upon this group. As they agree in every particular with those of M. de Kerguelen, we can reserve them until we relate the adventures of that navigator, and content ourselves with remarking that Cook surveyed the coasts carefully, and left them on the 31st of December. The vessels were enveloped in a thick fog, which accompanied them for more than 300 leagues. Anchor was cast in Adventure Bay, in Van Diemen's Land, on the 26th of January. It was the same spot at which Captain Verne had touched 4 years earlier. The English were visited by a few natives, who received the presents offered to them, without showing any satisfaction. The narrative says, "They were of ordinary height, but rather slightly built. Their skin was black and their hair of the same color, and as woolly as that of the Negroes of New Guinea, but they had not the thick lips or flat noses of African Negroes. There was nothing disagreeable in their features, and their eyes struck us as beautiful, so did their teeth, but they were very dirty. Most of them anointed their hair and beards with a yellow ointment, and some even rubbed their faces with the same stuff." Concise as this account is, it is not the less valuable. The race of Tasmanians is extinct, the last of them died a few years ago. Cook weighed anchor on the 30th of January, and took up his station at his usual point in Queen Charlotte Strait. The vessels were soon surrounded by pirogues, but not a single native ventured to go on board. They were so fully persuaded that the English had come to avenge their murdered comrades. Once convinced that the English had no such intention, they banished their mistrust and reserve. The captain soon found out by Mai's interpretation, he understanding the Zealand tongue, the right cause of this terrible catastrophe. It appeared that the English had been seated on the grass, taking their evening meal when the natives committed several thefts. One of them was caught and struck by a sailor. At his cry, his companions rushed upon the sailors of the Adventure, who killed two of them, but unfortunately succumbed to numbers. Several of the Zealanders pointed out to Cook the chief who had directed the carnage and urged Cook to kill him. But to the great surprise of the natives and the stupefaction of Mai, the captain refused. Mai remarked, "In England they kill a man who assassinates another. This fellow killed 10, and you take no revenge." Before he left, Cook landed pigs and goats, hoping that these animals might at length become acclimatized to New Zealand. Mai had a wish to take a New Zealander to Tahiti. Two offered to go, and Cook agreed to receive them, warning them at the same time that they would never see their native land again. But no sooner had the vessels lost sight of the shores of New Zealand than they began to weep. Seasickness added to their distress. But as they recovered from it, their sadness disappeared, and they soon attached themselves to their new friends. An island named Mangia was discovered on the 29th of March. At Mai's representations, the inhabitants decided to come on board. Small, but vigorous and well-proportioned, they wore their hair knotted upon the top of the head. They wore long beards and were tattooed in all parts of their bodies. Cook could not carry out his earnest wish to land, as the people were too hostile. A new island, similar to the last, was discovered 4 leagues further on. The natives appeared more friendly than those of Mangia, and Cook profited by this fact and landed a detachment under Lieutenant Gore, with Mai as interpreter. Anderson, the naturalist, an officer named Barnes, and Mai landed alone and unarmed, running the risk of being maltreated. They were received with solemnity and conducted through a crowd of men, with clubs on their shoulders, to the presence of 3 chiefs, whose ears were adorned with red feathers. They soon perceived a score of women, who danced in a grave and serious fashion, paying no attention to their arrival. The officers were separated from each other, and observing that the natives hastened to empty their pockets, they began to entertain fears for their safety when Mai reappeared. They were detained all day and forced several times to take their clothes off and allow the natives to examine the color of their skin, but night arrived at last without the occurrence of any disagreeable incident. The visitors regained their sloop, and coconuts, bananas, and other provisions were brought to them. The English may have owed their safety to the description Mai had given of the power of their weapons, and the experiment he made before them of setting fire to a cartridge. Mai had recognized 3 of his fellow countrymen in the crowd on the beach. These Tahitans had started in a pirogue to reach Ulaitia Island and had been driven out of their course by contrary winds. As they expected a short voyage, they had not provided themselves with food. Famine and fatigue had reduced their number to 4 men, all of them half dead, when the pirogue capsized. The unfortunate wretches managed to seize the side of their boat and support themselves in the water until they were picked up by the inhabitants of this island, Wateroo. It was now 12 years since fate threw them upon this shore, more than 200 leagues from their native island. They had contracted family ties and friendly alliances with these people, whose manners and language were not unlike their own. They refused to return to Tahiti. Cook says, "We may find in this incident a better explanation of the way in which detached portions of the globe, and particularly the islands of the Pacific, have been peopled than in any theories, especially in regard to those which are far from any other continent and at a great distance from each other." Wateroo Island is situated in 20 degrees 1 south latitude and degrees 45 east longitude. The 2 vessels afterwards reached a neighboring island called Wenua, upon which M. Gore landed to get fodder. Although the ruins of houses and tents were seen, it was uninhabited. On the 5th of April, Cook arrived in sight of Harvey Island, which he had discovered during his second voyage in 1773. At that time, it appeared to him deserted. He was, therefore, astonished to see several pirogues leave the shore and approach the ships, but the natives could not find courage to go on board. Their fierce appearance and noisy offers did not promise well for their friendly intentions. Their language was still more like that of Tahiti than that of the last islands they had visited. Lieutenant King was sent in search of good anchorage, but could not succeed in finding a suitable harbor. The natives, armed with spears and clubs, appeared disposed to resent any attempt at landing. Cook, in his great need of wood and water, determined to reach the friendly islands. He was sure of finding refreshments for his men and forage for his beasts there. The season was too far advanced, and the distance between these latitudes and the pole too great to allow of anything being attempted in the southern hemisphere. The wind obliged him to relinquish his idea of reaching Middleburg or Ia, as he had at first intended. He therefore directed his course towards Palmerston Island, where he arrived on the 14th of April, and where he found birds in abundance, scurvy grass, and coconuts. This island was merely a collection of 9 or 10 islets, very slightly raised, appearing almost like the points of reefs, belonging to one coral bank. The English reached Camango Island on the 28th of April, and the natives brought them quantities of coconuts, bananas, and other stores. They then proceeded to Anamuka, which is also part of the Tonga, or Friendly Archipelago. On the 6th of May, a chief of Tonga Tabu, named Whainau, visited Cook. He called himself king of all the Friendly Islands. "I received," says Cook, "a present from this great personage of 2 fish, which were brought to me by one of his servants. I paid him a visit after dinner. He came to meet me as soon as he saw me land. He appeared some 30 years of age, tall and of slender form, and I have met no countenance in these islands so European in type." When all the provisions of this island were exhausted, Cook visited a group of islets called Happy, where his reception was friendly, owing to the orders given by Whainau, and where he procured pigs, water, fruits, and roots. Some of the native warriors exhibited their skill in various singular combats, with clubs and boxing. "What most surprised us," says the narrative, "was to see 2 great women enter the lists and attack each other with their fists without the least ceremony, and with as much skill as the men. Their fight lasted about half a minute, when one of them declared herself beaten. The victorious heroine received as much applause from the assembled multitude as is usually accorded to a man who has overcome his rival by his skill and address." There was no cessation of the fetes and games. A dance was executed to the sound of 2 drums, or rather of 2 hollow trunks, by 105 performers, supported by a vocal choir. Cook reciprocated these demonstrations by putting his soldiers through their artillery exercises and letting off fireworks, which produced indescribable astonishment in the minds of the natives. Not wishing to be outdone in the attempt at display, the natives gave a concert, and then a dance, executed by 20 women crowned with China roses. This magnificent ballet was followed by another performance by 15 men, but we shall never end if we attempt to give an account of the wonders of this enthusiastic reception. It justly gained for the Tonga archipelago the name of Friendly Islands. On the 23rd, Whainau, who had represented himself as king of the entire archipelago, came to inform Cook of his departure for the neighboring island of Vaviao. He had excellent reasons for this, as he had just heard of the arrival of the real sovereign, named Fudafe or Pulaho. Cook at first refused to recognize the newcomer in this character, but he soon had irrefutable proof that the title of king belonged to him. Pulaho was extremely stout, which with his short height made him look like a barrel. If rank is proportioned to size in these islands, he was without exception the greatest chief the English had met with. Intelligent, grave, and dignified, he examined the vessel and everything that was new to him in detail, put judicious questions, and inquired into the motives of the arrival of these vessels. His followers objected to his descending below decks, saying it was taboo, and that it was not allowed for anyone to walk over his head. Cook, however, promised through the interpreter Mai that no one should be allowed to walk over his cabin, and so Pulaho dined with the captain. He ate little and drank still less, and invited Cook to land with him. The marks of respect lavished upon Pulaho by all the natives convinced Cook that he had been entertaining the real sovereign of the archipelago. On the 29th of May, Cook set sail on his return to Anamuka, thence to Tonga Tabu, where a feast or kiva, more magnificent than any he had seen, was given in his honor. "In the evening," he said, "we had the spectacle of a bomai, that is to say, the dances of the night were performed in front of Whainau's house. We saw 12 dances during the time. They were executed by women, and in the midst of them we noticed the arrival of a number of men, who formed a ring within that of the dancing women. 24 men, who executed a third, made a movement with the hands, which was greatly applauded, and which we had not previously seen. The orchestra was renewed once. Whainau appeared upon the scene at the head of 50 dancers, most magnificently apparelled. His garment consisted of cloth and a large piece of gauze, and round his neck small figures were suspended. Fate in Cook's honor at Tonga. Fate in Cook's honor at Tonga. Cook, after a stay of 3 months, thought it well to leave these enchanting islands. He distributed a share of the cattle he had bought at the Cape. and explained, through the way to feed them and their utility. Before leaving, he visited a cemetery or fayatuka, belonging to the king, composed of three good-sized houses, placed on the edge of a sort of hill. The planks of these buildings and the artificial hills which supported them were covered with pretty movable pebbles, and flat stones, placed erect, surrounded the whole. One thing which we had not previously seen was that the buildings were open on one side, and within there were two wooden busts, roughly carved, one at the entrance and the other a little within. The natives followed us to the door, but dared not pass the threshold. We asked them the meaning of the busts. They assured us that they did not represent any divinity, but were intended to recall two chiefs who were buried in the Fayatuka. Leaving Tonga Tabu on the 10th of July, Cook repaired to the Small of Ia, where his old friend Taiwan received him cordially. The captain learned from him that the property of the various islands in the archipelago belonged to the chiefs of Tonga Tabu, which was known as the Land of the Chiefs. Thus Pulaho had 150 islands under his rule. The most important are Vavo and Hamo. As for the Viti Islands, which are comprised in this number, they were inhabited by a warlike race, very superior in intelligence to those of the Friendly Islands. We can only refer to some of the many and interesting particulars collected by the captain and the naturalist Anderson, which relate to the gentleness and docility of the natives. Cook could do nothing but praise the welcome accorded to him, each time he stayed in the archipelago. But then he did not guess the project entertained by Yao and the other chiefs of assassinating him during the nocturnal Feast of Happy and of seizing his vessels. The navigators who succeeded him were not lavish in their praises, and if we did not know his sincerity, we should be tempted to think that the illustrious mariner gave the name of Friendly Islands to this group satirically. The inhabitants of Tonga Island always mourned the death of a relation by hitting themselves on their cheeks and by tearing them with whales' teeth, a custom which explains the many tumors and cicatrices they have on the face. If their friends are dangerously ill, they sacrifice one or two joints of their little finger to propitiate the divinity, and Cook did not meet with one native in 10 who was not mutilated. The expression tabu, he says, which plays so great a part in the language of this people, has a very wide significance. When they are not allowed to touch anything, they say it is taboo. They also told us that if the king enters a house belonging to one of his subjects, the house becomes taboo, and the owner of it may not live in it any longer. Cook fancied he had made out their religion. Their principal god was Kalifautanga, and in his anger, he destroys plantations and scatters illness and death. The religious ideas of all the islands are not alike, but the immortality of the soul is unanimously admitted. Although they do not offer fruit or other productions of the earth to their divinity, they sacrifice human victims. Cook lost sight of the Tonga Islands on the 17th of July, and the expedition arrived in sight of an island called Tabwai by the inhabitants, upon the 8th of August, after a series of tempestuous winds which caused serious damage to the Discovery. All the eloquence of the English failed to bring the natives on board. Nothing would induce them to leave their boats, and they contented themselves with inviting the strangers to visit them. But as time pressed, and Cook had no need of provisions, he passed the island without stopping, although it appeared to him fertile, and the natives assured him that it abounded in pigs and fowls. Strong, tall, and active, the natives had a hardy and savage appearance. They spoke the Tahitan language, which made intercourse with them easy. Some days later, the verdant summits of Tahiti appeared on the horizon, and the two vessels were not slow in stopping opposite the peninsula of Tarabin, where the welcome Mai received from his compatriots was as indifferent as possible. His brother-in-law, Chief Autai, would scarcely consent to recognize him, but when Mai showed him the treasures he brought back, amongst them all the famous red feathers, which had been so successful in Cook's last voyage, Odie changed his demeanor, treated Mai affably, and proposed to change names with him. Mai was overcome by these demonstrations of tenderness, and, but for Cook's interference, would have been robbed of all his treasures. The ships were well supplied with red feathers. Therefore fruits, pigs, and fowls appeared in great abundance during the stay in port. Cook, however, soon proceeded to Matavai Bay, where King Adu left his residence at Payne, to pay his old friend a visit. Mai was disdainfully received by his friends there also, and although he threw himself at the king's feet, when he presented him with a tuft of red feathers and 3 pieces of gold cloth, he was scarcely noticed. But as at Takaboo, the treatment changed suddenly upon the discovery of Mai's fortune, but he being only happy in the company of vagabonds, who laughed at him good-naturedly, even while they robbed him, was unable to acquire the influence over Atu and the principal chiefs which was necessary to the development of civilization. Cook had long heard that human sacrifices were common in Tahiti, but he had always refused to believe it. A solemn ceremonial which he saw at Adaur no longer allowed him to doubt the existence of the practice. In order to gain the favorable assistance of the Atwa, or Gadan, in an expedition against the island of Aimio, a man of the lowest social rank was killed by blows with clubs in the king's presence. As an offering, the hair and one eye of the victim was placed before the king, last signs of the cannibalism which formerly existed in this archipelago. At the end of this barbarous ceremony, which was a blot in the memoirs of so peaceable a people, a kingfisher alighted in the foliage. "It is Atwa," cried Atu, delighted at the happy augury. Human sacrifice at Tahiti. Human sacrifice at Tahiti. Facsimile of early engraving. Next day the ceremony was to be continued by a holocaust of pigs. The priests, like the Roman augurs, sought to read the history of the expedition in the dying struggles of the victims. Cook, who had silently assisted at the ceremony, could not conceal the horror with which it inspired him. Mai interpreted for him, eloquently and forcibly. Toha could scarcely contain his anger. "If the king had killed a man in England," said Mai, "as he has done the unhappy and innocent victim he has offered to his gods, it would have been impossible to save him from hanging, a punishment reserved for murderers and assassins." Mai's severe reflection was a little out of place. Cook should have remembered that manners vary with countries. It is absurd to attempt to apply to Tahiti, as punishment for that which is their custom, a punishment reserved in London for what is considered a crime. "Every man's house is his castle," says a popular proverb, which European nations have too often forgotten. Under the pretext of civilization, they have often shed more blood than would have flowed if they had not interfered. Before he left Tahiti, Cook bestowed all the animals he had had so much difficulty in bringing from Europe upon Atu. They were geese, ducks, turkeys, goats, sheep, horses, and cattle. Atu was at a loss to express his gratitude to the Eric no Praton, King of Britain, especially when he found that the English could not take a large pirogue on board which he had constructed as an offering for his friend the King of England, it being too large. The Resolution and the Discovery left Tahiti on the 30th of September and anchored at Aimio. In this place their stay was marked by a painful incident. Frequent thefts had occurred for several days, when a goat was stolen. To make an example, Cook burnt 5 or 6 cabins and set fire to a large number of pirogues, threatening the king with his anger if the animal were not immediately produced. As soon as he had obtained satisfaction, the captain started for Huahine with Mai, who was to settle on that island. A sufficiently large space of land was ceded by the chiefs of the Wara settlement in return for such presents. Upon this Cook had a house built, and planted a garden, where he planted European cabbages. Mai was left with 2 houses, 2 goats, and fowls. At the same time he was presented with a present of a coat of mail, of a complete set of armor, powder, balls, and guns, a portable organ, an electrical machine, fireworks, and domestic and agricultural implements, completed the collection of useful and ornamental presents, intended to give the Tahitans an idea of European civilization. Mai had a sister married at Huahine, but her husband occupied too humble a position for him to attempt to despoil him. Cook then solemnly declared that the native was his friend, and that in a short time he should return to ascertain how he had been treated, and that he should severely punish those who had acted badly to him. His threats were likely to be effective, as a few days earlier, some robbers, caught in the act by the English, had had their heads shaved and their ears cut. A little later at Raiatea, in order to force the natives to send back some deserters, Cook had carried off the entire family of the chief Oreo on one rope. The moderation exhibited by the captain in his first voyage constantly diminished. Every day he became more severe and exacting. This change in his conduct was fatal to him. The 2 Zealanders who had asked to accompany Mai were landed with him. The elder readily consented to live at Huahine, but the younger conceived such an affection for the English that it was necessary to use force, as it were, to land him, amid the most touching demonstrations of affection. At the last moment as anchor was weighed, Cook bid farewell to Mai, whose expression and tears testified to his comprehension of all he was to lose. Although Cook left satisfied with having loaded the young Tahitan who had trusted himself to him with benefits, he was also full of anxious fears as to his future. He knew his light and inconstant character, and he left him weapons with some regret, fearing that he might make a bad use of them. The king of Huahine gave Mai his daughter in marriage and changed his name to Peori, by which he was afterwards known. Mai profited by his high station to show his cruelty and inhumanity. Always armed, he began to try his skill with pistol and gun upon his fellow countrymen. His memory, therefore, is hated in Huahine, and the memory of his crimes was for a long time associated with that of the English. Cook visited Raiatea before leaving the island. He found his friend Ori deprived of supreme authority. Then he went to Ballabol on the 8th of December and bought of the King Powney an anchor, which Bougainville had lost in the roadstead. During his long sojourns in the different islands of the Society archipelago, Cook completed his geographical, hydrographical, and ethnological investigations, as well as his studies of natural history. In this difficult task, he was seconded by Anderson and by his entire staff, who invariably showed the greatest zeal in their efforts for the advancement of science. Tree, from beneath which Cook observed the transit of Venus. Tree, from beneath which Cook observed the transit of Venus. Facsimile of early engraving. On the 24th of December, Cook discovered another low island. It was uninhabited, and the crew obtained abundance of turtle there. It was named Christmas Island, in honor of the solemn anniversary of the morrow. Although 17 months had passed since he left England, Cook considered his voyage as only begun. Indeed, he had not as yet been able to put the part of his instructions relating to the exploration of the southern Atlantic and the search for a North Passage into execution. Captain Cook's Chart of Otaheite. Chapter 2. Discovery of the Sandwich Islands, exploration of the western shore of America, from thence to Bering Straits, return to the Howing Group, history of Roanoke, death of Cook, return of the expedition to England. On the 18th of January, 1778, in longitude 160 degrees and latitude 20 degrees north, the two vessels perceived the first islands of the Sandwich, or Howing archipelago. It did not take long to convince the navigators that they were inhabited. A large number of pirogues left Adhui, or Tavai Island, and surrounded the ships. The English were not a little surprised at hearing these natives speak in the Tahitan language. On this account, the intercourse between them was soon friendly, and next day numbers of the islanders agreed to go on board. They showed their astonishment and admiration at the sight of so many unknown objects by their looks, gestures, and continual exclamations. Iron they were acquainted with and called hamate. But their covetousness was soon excited by so many curiosities and precious things, and they tried to appropriate them both by honest and by illicit means. Their cleverness and their taste for thieving was as keen as is usual with the natives of the southern seas. It was necessary to take 1,000 precautions, and they were often taken in vain, to guard against their larceny. The English, when they approached the shore, under charge of Lieutenant Williamson, to sound and search for anchorage, were forced to repulse the attempts of the natives by force. The death of one of them repressed their turbulence in a measure, and gave them an exalted opinion of the strength of the new arrivals. As soon, however, as the Resolution and Discovery had cast anchor in Waimea Bay, Cook had himself taken on shore. He had scarcely touched land, when the natives assembled in a crowd upon the strand, prostrated themselves at his feet, and welcomed him with signs of the most profound respect. Cook's reception by the natives. Cook's reception by the natives. This extraordinary reception gave promise of a pleasant stay, for provisions appeared to be abundant. Fruits, pigs, fowls began to arrive from all parts. At the same time, a party of natives assisted the English sailors in filling the casks with water and in carrying them on board. Anderson and the draftsman Weller were encouraged by this friendly conduct to advance into the interior. They were not long in coming upon a morai, similar in every respect to the Tahitian morais. This discovery confirmed the English in the ideas induced by the similarity of the language with that of Tahiti. An engraving in Cook's narrative represents the interior of this morai. In it, two figures may be seen, standing, the top of the heads disappearing in high cylindrical hats, similar to those on the statues in Easter Island. In any case, the singular resemblance gives rise to reflection. Cook remained 2 days more in this anchorage, and could only extol the traffic with the natives. He then explored the neighboring island of Wanihio. In spite of his great wish to explore this interesting archipelago, he set sail, and from a distance perceived Wahoo Island and the reef of Tahura, which he designated by the general appellation of Sandwich Archipelago. This name has been superseded by the native appellation of Hawaii. Strong and vigorous, although of medium height, the Hawaiians are represented by Anderson as being of frank and loyal character. Not so serious as the natives of the Friendly Isles, they are less frivolous than the Tahitans. Clever, industrious, and intelligent, their plantations showed a knowledge of rural economy and an extensive taste for agriculture. They not only abstained from showing the childish and common curiosity which the English had so often noticed, but they inquired into their customs and evinced a certain regret for their own inferiority. The population appeared considerable and was estimated at 30,000 in Tavai Island alone. In their style of dress, their choice of food, their manner of preparing it, and their general habits, they conformed to the customs of Tahiti. This identity of two populations separated by a large stretch of sea gave the English much food for reflection. During his first stay, Cook did not become acquainted with any chief, but Captain Clerk of the Discovery at last received a visit from one. He was a young and well-made man, wrapped up from head to foot. The natives testified their respect by kneeling before him. Clerk made him several presents, and in return received a vase decorated with two small figures, fairly well sculptured, which served for the kava, a favorite drink of the Hawaiians, as well as the natives of Tonga. Their weapons comprised bows, clubs, and lances, the latter made of a strong and durable wood, and a sort of poignard called pafoa, terminating in a point at both ends. The custom of tabu was just as universally practiced as in the Friendly Islands, and the natives were always careful to ask if things were taboo before they touched them. On the 27th of February, Cook continued his course to the north, and soon fell in with the sea wrack of the rocks mentioned by the narrator of Lord Anson's voyage. On the 1st of March he steered for the east, in order to approach the American coast, and 5 days later he recognized New Albion, so named by Francis Drake. The expedition, coasting at a distance, surveyed Cape Blanc, already seen by Martin d'Aguilar on the 19th of January, 1603, and near which the geographers placed a large opening to the strait, the discovery of which they attributed to him. Shortly afterwards the latitude of Juan de Fuca was reached, but nothing resembling it was discovered, although this strait really exists, and divides the continent from Vancouver's Island. Cook soon reconnoitered a bay in latitude 49 degrees 15, to which he gave the name of Hope Bay. He anchored there to obtain water and give a little rest to his worn-out crews. This coast was inhabited, and 3 boats approached the vessels. One of the savages, he says, rose up and with many gesticulations made a long speech, which we understood as an invitation to land. In addition, he threw feathers towards us, and many of his companions threw us handfuls of dust or red powder. The native who usurped the post of orator was clothed in a skin, and in each hand he held something which he shook, and which emitted a sound like that of a child's rattle. When he was tired of haranguing and exhorting, of which we did not understand a word, he rested, but 2 other men took up the speech in succession. Their speeches were not so long, and they did not declaim so vehemently. Many of the natives had their faces painted in an extraordinary way and feathers fixed in their heads. Although they appeared friendly, it was impossible to persuade any of them to come on board. However, as the vessels had cast anchor, the captain had the sails furled, took in the topmasts, and unrigged the mizzen mast of the Resolution, in order to allow of repairs. Barter with the Indians soon commenced, and the most rigorous honesty prevailed. The objects offered were bear and wolf skins, and those of foxes, deers and polecats, weasels, and especially otters, which are found in the islands east of Kamchatka. Also clothes made of a kind of hemp, bows, lances, fishhooks, monstrous figures, and a kind of stuff of hair or wool, bags filled with red ochre, bits of sculptured wood, trinkets of copper and iron shaped like horseshoes, which they wore hung from the nose. Human ears and hands, not yet free from flesh, struck us most among the things they offered us. They made us clearly understand that they had eaten the portions that were missing, and we indeed perceived that these hands and ears had been on the fire. The English were not long in ascertaining that these natives were as habitual robbers as any they had hitherto met with. They were even more dangerous, as, possessing iron implements, they could easily cut the cords. They combined their thefts with intelligence, and one of them amused the sentinel at one end of the boat, whilst another snatched the iron from the other end. They sold a quantity of very good oil, and a great deal of fish, especially sardines. When the numerous repairs needed by the ships were made, and the grass required for the few goats and sheep remaining on board had been shipped, Cook set sail on the 26th of April, 1778. He gave the name of King George's Sound to the spot where he had stayed, although it was called Nootka by the natives. The vessels had scarcely gained the open sea when a violent tempest overtook them, during which the Resolution sprung a leak on the starboard side below the water line. Carried away by the storm, Cook passed the spot selected by geographers as the situation of the Strait of Admiral de Font, though he greatly wished to dispel all doubt on the subject. The captain therefore continued along the American coast, surveying and naming the principal points. During this cruise, he had constant intercourse with the Indians, and was not slow in noticing that their canoes had been replaced by boats, of which only the framework was wood, and over which were spread seal skins. Prince William Sound. Prince William Sound. After a stay at Prince William Sound, where the leak of the Resolution was repaired, Cook resumed his voyage, reconnoitered and named Elizabeth and St. Hermogene Capes, Banks Point, Capes Douglas and Bede, St. Augustine's Mount, the River Cook, Kodiak Island, Trinity Island, and the islands called Shumagen by Bering. Afterwards he passed Bristol Bay, Round Island, Calm Point, Newnham Cape, where Lieutenant Williamson landed, and Anderson Island, so called in honor of the naturalist, who died there of disease of the chest. Later, King Island and Prince of Wales's Cape, the most western extremity of America. Cook then passed the Asiatic coast and entered into communication with the Teachauchis, entered Bering Strait on the 11th of April, and next week came in contact with ice. He tried in vain to survey in various directions. The iceberg presented an insuperable barrier. On the 17th of April, 1778, the expedition was in latitude 70 degrees 41. During an entire month he coasted the iceberg, in the hope of finding an opening which might enable him to proceed to the north, but in vain. It was remarked that the ice was clear and transparent except in the upper part, which was slightly porous. I supposed, says Cook, that it was frozen snow, and it appeared to me that it must have been formed in the open sea, both because it is improbable, or rather impossible, that such enormous masses could float down rivers which contain too little water for a boat, and also because we perceived no produce of the earth, which we must have done if it was so formed. Up to this date, the passage through Bering Strait had been the least used to reach the northern latitudes. Cook's observation is valuable, as it proves that beyond this aperture a vast extent of sea without land must exist. It may possibly be, this was the view held by the lamented Gustave Lambert, that this sea is open. No greater distance north has ever been attained since Cook's time, except on the Siberian coast, where Plover and Long Islands were discovered, and where at this moment, as we write, Professor Nordenskjöld is exploring. 1. On the 5th September, 1879, a telegram from Stockholm announced that the Swedish Arctic expedition under Professor Nordenskjöld had made the northeast passage from Europe to Japan, and that the Swedish exploring vessel, the Vega, had arrived at Yokohama by way of Bering Straits. Translator. After most careful exploration and repeated efforts to reach higher latitudes, Cook, seeing that the season was advanced and encountering more icebergs daily, had no choice but to seek winter quarters in a more clement country, before continuing his expedition the following summer. He therefore retraced his route as far as Unalaska Island, and on the 26th of October steered towards the Sandwich Islands, hoping to complete his survey of them during his wintering there. An island was discovered on the 26th of November. The natives sold a quantity of fruits, roots, breadfruits, potatoes, taro, and eddy roots, which they exchanged for nails and iron implements. It was Maui Island, which forms part of the Sandwich Archipelago. Shortly afterwards, Ohihi or Hawaii was sighted, the summits of which were covered with snow. The captain says, "We never met savages so liberal as these in their views. They usually sent the different articles they wished to sell to the ships. They then came on board themselves and finished their trade on the quarterdeck. The Tahitans, in spite of our constant stays there, have not the same confidence in us. I conclude from this that the inhabitants of Ohihi are more accurate and true in their reciprocal trade than those of Tahiti, for the latter have no honor among themselves, and are thus not inclined to believe in the honor of others." On the 17th of January, Cook and Clerke cast anchor in a bay, called by the natives Karakakwa. The sails were unbent from the yards and the topmasts struck. The vessels were crowded with visitors and surrounded by pirogues, and the shore was covered by a curious multitude. Cook had never previously seen so much excitement. Among the chiefs who came on board the Resolution, a young man named Persia was soon remarked. He said he was Ayakani, but it was not known that was his title of office, or if it suggested a degree of relationship or alliance with the king. However, he evidently had great authority over the common people. Some presents, opportunely given, attached him to the English, and he rendered them more than one service. If Cook on his first visit to Hawaii pronounced that the natives were little disposed to robbery, he was not of the same opinion this time. Their large numbers gave them many facilities for thieving trifles and encouraged them to think that their larceny would not be punished. It became evident at last that they were encouraged by their chiefs, for several stolen objects were found in the possession of the latter. Peria and another chief named Canina brought an old man on board, whose name was Ko. He was very thin, and his body was covered with white scurf from immoderate use of ava. He was a priest. When he was presented to Cook, he put a sort of red mantle which he had brought upon his shoulders, and gravely delivered a long discourse as he gave him a little pig. It was soon proved that it was intended as a form of adoration, for all the idols were clothed in similar stuff. The English were immensely astonished at the whimsical ceremonies of homage presented to Cook. They only understood them later, through the researches of the learned missionary Ellis. We shall give a brief account of his interesting discovery. It will make the recital of the events that followed plainer. They gave him a little pig. They gave him a little pig. According to tradition, a certain Rono who lived under one of the ancient kings of Hawaii had killed his wife, whom he tenderly loved in a transport of jealousy. The grief and sorrow which followed upon his act drove him mad. He ran about the island, quarreling with and striking everybody. At last, tired out but not satiated with murder, he embarked, promising to return one day upon a floating island, bringing coconuts, pigs, and dogs. This legend had been embodied in a national song and became an article of faith with the priests, who added Rono to their list of deities. Confident in the fulfillment of the prediction, they awaited his coming every year with a patience which nothing could exhaust. Is not there a strange resemblance between this legend and that relating to the Mexican god Quetzalcoatl, who, forced to fly from the wrath of a more powerful god, embarked upon a skiff of serpent skin, promising those who accompanied him to return at some later time and visit the country with his descendants? As soon as the English ships appeared, the high priest Ko and his son One-Law declared that it was Rono himself, fulfilling his prediction. From that moment Cook was a divinity for the entire population. As he went about, the natives prostrated themselves. The priests made him speeches or addressed prayers to him. They would have sprinkled him with incense had that been fashionable at Hawaii. The captain felt that there was something extraordinary in these demonstrations, but, unable to understand it, he resigned himself for the sake of his crew, and for the advancement of science to the mysterious circumstances he was unable to unravel. He was obliged to give himself up to all kinds of ceremonies, which appeared, to him at least, ridiculous. Thus he was taken to a morai, a solid construction of stone 40 roods long and 14 high. The summit was well built and was surrounded by a wooden balustrade, upon which were hung the ears of the captives sacrificed to the gods. At the opening of the platform were two large wooden figures with grinning faces, and bodies draped in red stuff, the heads surmounted by a large piece of sculptured wood, the shape of a reversed cone. Their mounted with Cook upon a sort of table, under which lay a rotten pig and a quantity of fruit. Some men brought a living pig in a procession, and some scarlet cloth in which it was wrapped. The priests then sang some religious hymns, while the assistants were devoutly prostrated at the entrance of the morai. After various ceremonies, which it would take too long to describe, a pig, cooked in the oven, was presented to the captain, with fruits and the roots which were used in the preparation of ava. The ava, says Cook, was then handed round, and when we had tasted it, Ko and Peria divided the flesh of the pig into several pieces, which they placed in our mouths. I felt no repugnance when Peria, who is very clean, gave me something to eat, says Lieutenant King, but Cook, to whom Ko offered the same attention, could not swallow a morsel, as he thought of the putrid pig. The old man, wishing to redouble his politeness, tried to give him pieces already chewed, and one can easily imagine that the disgust of our captain increased. After this ceremony Cook was conducted to his boat, by 4 men carrying sticks, who repeated the same words and phrases as at the landing, in the midst of a kneeling host of the natives. The same ceremonies were observed every time the captain landed. One of the priests always walked before him, announcing that Rono had landed and ordering the people to prostrate themselves. If the English had reason to feel satisfied with the priests, who loaded them with attentions and presents, it was otherwise with the cares, or warriors. The latter encouraged the robberies which were perpetrated daily, and in other ways exhibited disloyalty. Still, up to the 24th of January, 1779, no important event occurred. Upon that day, the English were surprised to see that none of the pirogues left the river to trade with the ships. The arrival of Teriabu had made the bay taboo and prevented any communication with the strangers. Upon the same day, the chief, or rather king, went without ceremony to the ships. He had but one pirogue, in which were his wife and children. On the 26th, Teriabu paid a second visit, which was official. Cook, says the narrative, noticing that the prince landed, followed him and arrived about the same time. He conducted them to the tent. They were scarcely seated when the prince rose, and in a graceful manner threw his mantle over the captain's shoulders. He further placed a hat of feathers upon his head, and a curious fan in Cook's hands, at whose feet he also spread 5 or 6 very pretty mantles of great value. Teriabu and the principal chiefs of his suite asked many questions of the English as to the time of their leaving. The captain wished to ascertain the opinion the Houyans had formed of the English, but he could only learn that they supposed them to be the natives of a country where provisions were scarce, and that they had simply come there to fill their stomachs. This conviction arose from the emaciated appearance of some of the sailors and from the desire to ship fresh victuals. There was no fear, however, of exhausting their provisions, in spite of the immense quantity which had been consumed since the English arrived. It is very likely that the king wished for time to prepare the present he intended to offer the strangers upon their leaving, and accordingly, the day before the one fixed upon, the king begged captain's cook and clerk to accompany him to his residence. Enormous heaps of every kind of vegetable, parcels of stuffs, yellow and red feathers, and a herd of pigs were collected together. All this was a gratuitous gift to the king from his subjects. Teriabu chose about a third of these articles and gave the rest to the two captains, a more valuable present than they had ever received either at Tonga or Tahiti. On the 4th of February, the vessels left the bay, but the damage received by the Resolution forced her to put in again in a few days. The vessels had scarcely cast anchor before the English noticed a change in the conduct of the natives. Still, all went on peaceably until the afternoon of the 13th. Upon that day, several chiefs wished to prevent the natives from assisting the English in filling their casks. A tumult ensued. The natives armed themselves with stones and became threatening. The officer in command of the detachment was ordered by Cook to draw upon the natives if they persisted in throwing stones or became insolent. Under these circumstances, a pirogue was fired into, and it was soon apparent that a robbery had been committed by its crew. At the same time, a still more serious dispute arose. A sloop belonging to Persia was seized by an officer, who took it to the Discovery. The chief hastened to claim his belongings and to protest his innocence. The discussion grew animated, and Persia was overthrown by a blow from an oar. The natives, who had hitherto been peaceable observers, armed themselves with stones, forced the sailors to retire precipitately, and took possession of the pinnace which had brought them. Persia, forgetful of his resentment at this moment, interposed and restored the pinnace to the English, together with several things which had been stolen. "I am afraid the Indians will force me to violent measures," said Cook, upon learning what had passed. "We must not allow them to believe that they have gained an advantage over us." The boat of the Discovery was stolen upon the 13th or 14th of February. The captain determined to possess himself of the person of Teriabu, or some others of the leading persons, and to keep them as hostages until the stolen objects were restored to him. He therefore landed with a detachment of marines and pursued his way to the king's residence. He was received with the usual marks of respect on the road, and perceiving Teriabu and his 2 sons, to whom he said a few words on the theft of the sloop, he decided to pass the day on board the Resolution. The matter took a happy turn, and the 2 young princes embarked upon the pinnace, when one of Teriabu's wives begged him with tears not to go on board. 2 other chiefs joined her, and the natives, frightened by the hostile preparations they saw, began to crowd round the king and captain. The latter hurried to embark, and the prince appeared willing to follow him, but the chiefs interposed and used force to prevent his doing so. Cook, seeing that his project had failed, and that he could only put it into execution by bloodshed, gave it up and walked quietly along the shore to regain his boat, when a rumor spread that one of the principal chiefs had been killed. The women and children were therefore sent away, and all directed their attention to the English. A native armed with a pahua defied the captain, and as he would not cease his threats, Cook discharged his pistol. The native, protected by a thick mat, did not feel himself wounded, and so became more audacious. Several others advanced, and the captain discharged his gun at the nearest and killed him. This was the signal for a general attack. The last that was seen of Cook was his signing to the boats to cease firing and to approach that his small troop might embark. In vain, the captain was struck and fell to the earth. The natives, says the narrative, uttered cries of joy when they saw him fall. They at once dragged his body along the shore, and taking the poniard one after the other, they all attacked him with ferocious blows until he ceased to breathe. Thus perished this great navigator, assuredly the most illustrious produced by England. The boldness of his undertakings, his perseverance in carrying them out, and the extent of his knowledge all made him a type of the true sailor of discovery. Itinerary of the principal voyagers during the 18th century, after Cook. Grave par e moriu. Facsimile of early engraving. What immense service he has rendered to geography. In his first voyage, he reconnoitered the Society Islands, proved that New Zealand is formed of two islands, explored the strait that separates them, and surveyed its coast, and lastly he visited the entire eastern coast of New Holland. In his second voyage, he proved the chimerical character of the long-talked-of Antarctic continent, the dream of stay-at-home geographers. He discovered New Caledonia, southern Georgia, the Sandwich Islands, and penetrated farther into the southern hemisphere than anyone had done before him. In his third expedition, he discovered the Hawaiian archipelago and surveyed the eastern coast of America, to the 43rd degree, that is to say, an extent of 3,500 miles. He passed through Bering Straits and ventured into the Arctic Sea, which was the horror of navigators, until the icebergs opposed an impenetrable barrier to his progress. It is needless to praise his qualities as a seaman. His hydrographical works remain, but above all, his careful treatment of his crews deserves to be remembered. To it was due their ability to bear the long and trying voyages, which he made with so little loss of life. After this fatal day, the English folded their tents and returned on board. Their offers for the recovery of the body of their unfortunate captain were in vain. In their anger, they were about to have recourse to arms, when two priests, friends of Lieutenant King, brought a piece of human flesh at the instance of the other chiefs, which weighed from 9 to 10 pounds. It was all, they said, that remained of Roano's body, which had been burnt according to custom. This sight, of course, made the English still more anxious for reprisals, and the natives on their side had to avenge the death of 5 chiefs and a score of men. Every time the English landed at their watering place, they found a furious crowd armed with stones and sticks. In order to make an example, Captain Clerke, who had taken the command of the expedition, set fire to the abodes of the priests and massacred those who opposed them. On the 19th of February, however, an interview was arranged, and the remains of Cook, his hands, recognizable by a large scar, his head, stripped of flesh and various other debris, were made over to the English, who 3 days later paid them the last honors. After that, barter was resumed as if nothing had happened, and no other incident occurred during the remainder of the stay in the Sandwich Islands. Captain Clerke had relinquished the command of the Discovery to Lieutenant Gore and hoisted his flag upon the Resolution. After completing the survey of the Hawaiian Islands, he set sail for the north, touched at Kamchatka, where the Russians made him heartily welcome, passed through Bering Strait, and advanced as far as latitude 69 degrees 50 north, where his further progress was barred by icebergs. On the 22nd of April, 1779, Captain Clerke died of pulmonary phthisis, aged 38. Captain Gore then assumed the command-in-chief, put in again at Kamchatka, again at Canton, and at the Cape of Good Hope, and anchored in the Thames on the 1st of October, 1780, after more than 4 years' absence. The death of Captain Cook caused a general mourning throughout England. The Royal Society of London, of which he was a member, struck a medal in his honor, the cost of which was covered by public subscription, to which persons of the highest rank subscribed. The Admiralty petitioned the king to provide for the family of the deceased captain. The king granted a pension of 200 to his widow, Annal, to each of his 3 sons. The charts and drawings relating to his last voyage were engraved at the expense of the government, and the proceeds of their sale divided among Cook's family and the heirs of Captain Clerke and Captain King. Although the family of the great navigator is extinct, a proof of the esteem in which his memory is held was given in the solemn meeting of the French Geographical Society on the 4th of February, 1879. A large number assembled to celebrate the centenary of Cook's death. Amongst them were many representatives of the Australian colonies, which are now so flourishing, and of the Hawaiian archipelago, where he met his death. A quantity of relics belonging to the great navigator, his charts, Weber's magnificent watercolors, and the instruments and weapons of the oceanic islanders decorated the walls. This touching homage, after the lapse of 100 years, was accorded by a people whose king had bidden them not to thwart Cook's scientific and civilizing mission, and was well calculated to awaken echo in England, and to draw yet closer the bonds of that good fellowship which exists between England and France. End of the first part. Part 2. Death of Captain Cook. Chapter 1. French Navigators. 1. Discoveries made by Bouvet de Lozier in the southern seas. Surville, the land of the Arsacides. Incident during the stay at Port Praslin. Arrival upon the coast of New Zealand. Death of Surville. Marian's discoveries in the Antarctic Ocean. He is murdered at New Zealand. Kerguelen in Iceland and the Antarctic regions. The contest between the watches, Fleurien and Verdun de la Crenne. In the earlier half of the 18th century, a discovery had been made which was destined to exercise a favorable influence upon the progress of geographical science. Jean-Baptiste Charles Bouvet de Lozier, a captain of one of the East India Company's ships, was so struck by the immensity of the space surrounding the southern pole, known to geographers as the Terra Australis Incognita, that he begged for the privilege of prosecuting discoveries in these unknown regions. His importunities were long disregarded, but at length, in 1738, the company consented, in the hope of opening new facilities for trade. Two small frigates, the Aigle and the Marie, fully equipped, left Brest upon the 19th of July, 1738, under command of Bouvet de Lozier. After a stay of a month at St. Catherine's Island, upon the coast of Brazil, they put to sea again upon the 13th of November and steered for the southeast. On the 26th, heavy fog set in, so that the vessels could only keep in company by constant firing, and were obliged to tack about continually, at the risk of running foul of each other. Upon the 5th of December, although it would have appeared impossible, the fog increased in density to such an extent that those on board the Aigle could hear the movement of the Marie, though they could not see her. The sea was covered with kelp, and seagulls, never found at a distance from land, were shortly afterwards seen. Upon the 15th of December, says M. Favre, in his memoir The Bouvets in 48 degrees 50 S. lat. Paris is in N. lat. 48 degrees 50 and in 7 degrees W. long. The meridian of Tenerife, an enormous iceberg was perceived towards 5 or 6 in the morning. Shortly afterwards many others were seen, surrounded by ice floes of various sizes. The Marie, signaling danger, tacked about, but Bouvet, annoyed by this action, which was likely to affect the confidence of the crews, crowded sail on the Aigle, and by passing the Marie, showed his determination to maintain his southern course. To reassure his men, he asserted that it was considered a lucky omen to meet with ice, as it was a certain indication of land at hand. The course was continued to the south, and Bouvet's perseverance was soon rewarded by the appearance of land, to which he gave the name of Cape Circumcision. It was steep, covered with snow, and so shut in by large icebergs that it was impossible to approach to within 7 or 8 leagues. It appeared to measure from 4 to 5 leagues from north to south. This land was supposed, says M. Favre, judging from Pietergo's charts which were used by Bouvet, to be situated in 54 degrees S. lat. and degrees east of the meridian of Tenerife, or between 5 degrees 30 and degrees 3 east of that of Paris. Bouvet would much have liked to make closer acquaintance with this region, but the fogs and contrary winds prevented his reaching it, and he was obliged to satisfy himself with observing it from a distance. Upon the 3rd of January 1739, says Bouvet in his report to the company, we made up for what we had lost during the preceding days, and about 4 in the afternoon, the fog clearing somewhat, we distinctly saw land. The coast, broken throughout its entire length, formed several bays. The summits of the mountains were covered with snow, the sides appeared wooded. After several fruitless attempts to near the coast, Bouvet was forced to relinquish the idea. His sailors were worn out with fatigue, discouraged, and enfeebled by scurvy. The Marie was sent to the Isle of France, and the Aigle directed her course to the Cape of Good Hope, which she reached upon the 28th of February. We had penetrated, says Bouvet, in the report already cited, 12 or 1500 leagues into an unknown sea. For 70 days we had encountered almost continuous fog. We had been for 40 days in the midst of ice, and we had had snow and hail almost every day. Several times our decks and rigging were covered with them. Our shrouds and sails were frozen. On the 10th of January, it was impossible to work our foretopsail. The cold was severe, for men accustomed to a warm climate and who were lightly clad. Many had chilblains on the hands and feet. Still, they were forced constantly to tack about, bring to, get underway, and take soundings at least once a day. One of the sailors belonging to the Aigle, having been sent to loosen the foretopsail, became frozen in the foretop. He had to be lowered by a whip, and circulation was with difficulty restored. I have seen others with tears gushing from their eyes as they handled the sounding line. And all this was in the fine season, and I ameliorated their condition by every means in my power. We can readily understand that such small results did not tempt the East India Company to continue their efforts in these latitudes. If they were productive of no good, they cost heavily in the loss of men and ships they entailed. Still, Bouvet's discovery was a first blow to the existing belief in an Antarctic continent. He gave the start, and various navigators, amongst them 2 Frenchmen, followed it up. In our short record of this expedition, which is scarcely known, we have testified to an appreciation of our countryman, who was the pioneer of Antarctic navigation, and who deserves the credit of furnishing an example to the great English explorer, James Cook. Another of the East India Company's captains, who had distinguished himself in various battles against the English, Jean-François Marie de Surville, was destined to make important discoveries in Oceania some 30 years later, and to rediscover, almost simultaneously with Cook, the lands first seen by Tasman, and which he called Staten Island. The following is an account of the circumstances. Messrs. Law and Chevalier, governors in French India, determined to send a vessel at their own risk to trade in the southern seas. They admitted Surville to their schemes, and sent him to France to obtain the needful authority from the company, and to superintend the equipment of the vessel. The Saint Jean-Baptiste was made ready for sea at Nantes, and provisioned for 3 years, with every requisite for a distant expedition. Surville then reached India, where Law provided him with 24 native soldiers. Leaving Angley Bay on the 3rd of March, 1769, the Saint Jean-Baptiste put in successively at Masulipatam, Yangon, and Pondicherry, where her equipment was completed. Surville left the last-named port on the 2nd of June and steered his course for the Philippines. On the 20th of August, he cast anchor off the Bashies, or Bashi Islands. Dampier had so named them after an intoxicating drink, which the natives compounded from the juice of the sugar cane, into which they infused a certain black seed. Several of Dampier's crew had formerly deserted in these islands. They had received from the natives a field, agricultural instruments, and wives. The recollection of this fact incited 3 of the sailors belonging to the Saint Jean-Baptiste to follow their example. But Surville was not the man to allow his crew to melt away in such a manner. He seized 26 Indians, and signified his intention of keeping them as hostages until his men were brought back to him. Among the Indians thus seized, says Crozet, in his narrative of Surville's voyage, there were several courageous enough to throw themselves into the sea, and much to the surprise of the crew, they had sufficient courage and skill to swim to one of their pirogues, which was far enough from the vessel to be secure from danger. Pains were taken to make the savages understand that they had been treated in this way in order to make their comrades bring back the 3 deserters. They made signs that they understood, and were then released with the exception of 6, who had been taken on shore. The haste with which they left the ship and flung themselves into their pirogues augured badly for their return. Much surprise was therefore felt when in a short time they were seen returning with joyful acclamations. Doubt was no longer possible. They could only be bringing the deserters back to the commander. They came on board and proceeded to deposit on deck, what? 3 magnificent pigs, tied and bound. Surville did not appreciate, and he objurgated the natives so fiercely that they jumped into their pirogues and disappeared. 24 hours later, the Saint Jean-Baptiste left the Bashies, taking 3 captive Indians to replace the deserters. Map of Surville's discoveries after Fleurieu. Upon the 7th of October, after a lengthened route to the southeast, land, to which the name of Première View was given, was sighted in 6 degrees 56, S lat and degrees 30 long, east of Paris. The explorers coasted along it until the 13th October, upon which day an excellent port was discovered, sheltered from every wind and formed by a number of small islands. M. de Surville cast anchor and named it Port Praslin. It is situated in 7 degrees 25 S lat, and degrees 55 E long, reckoning from the Paris meridian. Upon entering this port, the French saw several Indians, armed with spears and carrying a sort of shield. The Saint Jean-Baptiste was very soon surrounded by pirogues, manned by a crowd of Indians, who were profuse in menacing gestures. However, they were pacified at last. About 30 of the boldest clambered onto the deck and examined everything they saw with close attention. It soon became needful to check their advances, as there were many sick among the crew, and it was unwise to allow too many natives on board. Pirogues of the Admiralty Islands. Pirogues of the Admiralty Islands. Facsimile of early engraving. In spite of the welcome they received, the natives were still doubtful, and their looks expressed distrust. The slightest movement on board the vessel was sufficient to make them jump into their pirogues or the sea. One only showed a little more confidence, and Serville gave him several presents. The Indian acknowledged the attention by saying he could point out a spot where good water was to be had. The captain gave orders to arm the boats and entrusted the command to his lieutenant Lab. The savages appeared impatient for the departure of the boats from the ship, says Florian, in his Découvertes des Franchises, and they were no sooner lowered than they were followed by all the pirogues. One of these appeared to lead the others. In it was the Indian who had offered his services to Serville. At the back of the pirogue, a man stood erect, holding in his hands a bunch of herbs, raising them above his head with a rhythmical movement. In the center of the same pirogue stood a young man, resting upon a spear, who gravely watched all that went on. Red flowers were in his ears and passed through the cartilage of his nose, and his hair was powdered with white lime. Certain trifling symptoms aroused the suspicions of the French, who soon found themselves in a cul-de-sac, where the natives persisted in declaring that fresh water was to be found. Lab, in spite of all the persuasions of the natives, did not wish to imperil his boats in 2 or 3 feet of water with a muddy bottom, and therefore allowed only a corporal and 4 soldiers to disembark. They soon returned, asserting that they had seen on all sides nothing but marsh, in which the men would sink to the waist. It was evident that the natives had meditated treason. Lab took good care not to let them suspect that he had detected their design, and asked them to point out a spring. The natives then led the boat some 3 leagues away, to a spot from whence it was impossible to see the ship. The corporal was again sent forward with some men, but he found only a very poor spring, barely affording sufficient water to slake the thirst of his party. During his absence, the natives did all in their power to induce Lab to land, pointing out to him the abundant coconut and other fruit trees, and even attempting to possess themselves of the boat-hook. More than 250 of these natives, says the narrative, armed with spears from 7 to 8 feet long, with swords or wooden clubs, arrows, and stones, and some carrying shields, were assembled on the shore, observing the movements of the boats. When the detachment, consisting of 5 men, proceeded to re-embark, the natives fell upon them, wounding one soldier with a blow from a club, the corporal with a spear, and many others in different ways. Lab himself was hit by 2 arrows in the thigh, and on the leg by a stone. The traitors were fired upon. The first volley so astonished them that they remained motionless. It was the more fatal, as, being fired only 3 or 5 fathoms from the boats, every shot took effect. The amazement of the natives gave the opportunity for a second discharge, which completely routed them, the death of their chief greatly hastening their flight. Lab, who had recognized him, apart from the others, with his hands raised to heaven, striking his breast, and encouraging the assailants by his voice, aimed at him and shot him dead. The natives carried off their wounded, leaving 30 or 40 dead upon the field of battle. It was then possible to land, and picking up such of the enemy's weapons as were scattered about, the victors contented themselves with towing away one of their pirogues and destroying the others. Picking up the enemy's weapons. Picking up the enemy's weapons. Serville was extremely anxious to capture an Indian, who might serve him as a guide, and who, convinced of the superiority of European weapons, might warn his countrymen against opposing the French. With this view, he hit upon a singular expedient. He ordered 2 Negro sailors to be placed on board the pirogue he had seized, had their heads powdered, and disguised them so cleverly that the natives were likely to be deceived. In fact, a pirogue soon after approaching the Saint Jean-Baptiste, the men who were in it, seeing what they took to be 2 of their own people trafficking with the strangers, drew nearer. So soon as the French imagined they were at a fair distance, they launched 2 boats in pursuit. The natives gained ground. It was then decided to fire in order to stop them. One of the natives was killed at once, and his boat capsizing, he fell into the sea, and the other, who was only 14 or 15 years of age, endeavored to reach the shore by swimming. He defended himself most courageously, says the narrative, sometimes making believe to bite himself, but really biting those who held him. His hands and feet were tied, and he was taken on board. He counterfeited death for an hour, but when he was made to sit up and he fell back on deck, he took good care to fall on his shoulders instead of his head. When he was tired of playing this game, he opened his eyes, and seeing that the crew were eating, he asked for a biscuit, ate it with a good appetite, and made many expressive signs. He was bound securely so that he might not throw himself overboard. During the night, it was necessary to resort to firing, to disperse the pirogues, which approached with a view to surprising the ship. Next day, the native was taken in a boat to a small islet, since called Aguade Island. Scarcely had he landed when it was perceived that he had almost cut through the ropes with a sharp shell. The young savage was taken by a different route to the shore. When he perceived that he was to re-embark, he rolled upon the ground, shrieking and biting the sand in his fury. The sailors succeeded at last in finding an abundant spring and plenty of wood. One of the trees they cut appeared to have dyeing properties, for it tinged the sea with red. Some of the bark was boiled, and pieces of cotton steeped in the decoction turned deep red. Welcome refreshment was afforded to the crew by the palm cabbages, good oysters, and various shellfish which abounded. There were indeed many sufferers from scurvy on board the Saint Jean Baptiste. Surville had looked forward to this stay to cure them, but the rain, which fell ceaselessly for 6 days, aggravated their complaint to such a degree that 3 of them died before they left the anchorage.